best intentions, he promptly fell asleep. When he awoke, he noticed to his chagrin that someone had been in and taken his clothes away. New clothes were laid across a chair. He decided he'd better finish up before anyone else intruded. First, he washed his face again and rinsed his eyes before he got soap in the water. Then, using the soap and scrub brushes, he scrubbed himself from head to toe, cleaning out the wound on his leg as well as he could. It looked like a clean cut and not too deep. It was hard to get out of the water. Despite the fire on the hearth, the room was chilly. He climbed out and wrapped a towel around himself. As if by signal, the bathing girls burst back through the door, bringing warm towels to dry him off with. This time, Ash submitted. He was too tired to resist.
"You look much better, sir, without that layer of dirt," the smaller girl said approvingly.
She ran the tips of her fingers over the muscles on his chest, raising goose flesh.
"We don't see many men who work with their backs for a living. It looks well on you, and you've a fine backside, too, if I may say so. It's all muscles, not like them who sit all day. He has a nice front side, too,"
the bigger girl said, elbowing the smaller one.
"That's a fancy neckpiece you got on,"
she said, reaching for his amulet.
"Don't touch that."
Ash yanked it out of reach.
"I wasn't going to steal it,"
the girl said, pouting a little.
"How did you cut your leg, then?" the small girl asked. "Looks like a bad gash."
"I don't know how that happened," Ash said. They had a basket of fragrant lotions and ointments that they wanted to use on his burned face and the cut on his leg, but he refused. He thought of asking for his remedy bag from the stables, but then remembered that it was likely either burned up or lying somewhere in the maze of passages in the cellar. The servants finally left him on his own to get dressed. The clothing that had been left for him consisted of small clothes and a tunic and trousers in a soft, plain-woven fabric of a dark brown color, like bark. They were comfortable and fit as if they had been made to size. There were soft brown boots also. He wondered what had happened to his old clothes, in case he was expected to give these back when his audience with the king was over. He padded barefoot to the door and opened it a crack. The bathing girls were gone, but 2 blackbirds stood just outside. They both turned and looked at him, hands on the hilts of their swords. He closed the door and sighed. He sat down in one of the chairs by the fire, feeling trapped and helpless, and half sick and hungry and dead tired. It would take a while to recover from healing Haman, and in the meantime he'd be close to helpless. "Well, Sulhan," he thought, "you were hot to get into the palace, and here you are." Maybe when he had a little power on board, he could take advantage of it. He lay down on the bed and was almost asleep again when he heard voices raised out in the hallway. This went on for a few minutes, some kind of argument, and then the door opened. It was Lila, still wearing the clothes she had on in the courtyard, a white blouse, black skirt, and deep blue overdress with a laced bodice. Ash sat bolt upright and swung his legs over the side of the bed, suddenly wide awake. Lila put a finger to her lips, closed the door, waited a minute, and put her ear to it. Then she circled the room, poking behind draperies and tapestries, and looking under the bed. She crossed the room and stood over him, hands on hips, and said, "Have you lost your mind, princeling? It wasn't enough that assassins try to murder you in your bed. I saved your ass, and this is the thanks I get? You turtle my wine and come straight here so they can have another go?" One thing you had to say about Lila: she knew how to launch an offense. Ash just looked at her and said nothing. He was no wordsmith, but experience had taught him that silence was often the winning hand where Lila was concerned. "Well, what the hell are you doing here?" She held his gaze for a moment or two, as if that might get her a response, then began pacing back and forth next to the bed. "What were you thinking, using magic in the middle of the courtyard? I know you're a rum healer, but you couldn't let somebody else be the hero this one time?" "If I had, Haman would be dead," Ash said evenly. That's beside the point, Lila said, likely because she knew it was true. Nobody expects you to sacrifice yourself to save somebody else. I'm the reason he got burned, Ash said. I had a certain obligation to fix him. Lila stopped pacing and swung around. What are you talking about? Never mind, Ash said. The less information he divulged to Lila, the better, until he figured out her game. Why are you here? Aside from badgering me, I mean. I'm supposed to ask you if there are any herbs or remedies you might need, beyond the standard sort, so I can be on the lookout for them. I mean, why are you in Arden's court? Is this where you've been spending your summers? Cozying up to the King of Arden? You could have mentioned that the two of you were friends. For a moment, Lila had no comeback. We're not friends, she said, avoiding Ash's eyes. I'm here on business. What kind of business? None of yours. I'm not accountable to you. Who are you accountable to? Myself, Lila said. Maybe you're the one that gave me up to the Darians at Odin's Ford. Right, she said, staring up at the ceiling. And then I turned around and rescued you. You know women, changeable as a day in April. Sometimes we just can't make up our minds. Maybe you figured you'd collect twice, once from the Darians for outing me, and once from my mother for bringing me home. Lila went back to offense. You're not planning to do something rash, are you? Such as? Such as trying to kill Montaigne. Do you think nobody's thought of that before? Do you think professionals haven't tried? You're an amateur, Sulhan. Don't let the fact that you're a wizard make you overconfident. This king is surrounded by mages, and he wears a clan-made talisman night and day to protect against magical attacks. Bellamy was right, Ash thought. Good to know. He employs a taster and takes antidotes against common poisons on a regular basis. What about uncommon poisons? Where does he get the antidotes? Lila released an exasperated breath. I should save myself a lot of trouble and hand you over to the king. I'm sure he'd offer a rich reward. Instead, I've got to find a way to get you out of here, which won't be easy now that His Majesty is all smitten with you. She began pacing again. I don't have time for this. I missed the part where I asked for your help, Ash said. Why do you care so much? You don't have anything on the table, as far as I can see. All I want for you is to go about your business and leave me alone. I would love to take care of business, Lila muttered, and I don't need an entitled runaway wizard blue-blood princeling mucking it up. No problem, Ash said. Stay out of my way, and I'll stay out of yours. Huh, Lila said. We'll see. You'll find it's hard to stay out of anyone's way in this place. 22. Homecoming. To Jenna's surprise, Karn and his blackbirds didn't bother to bring in a healer to treat the wound just below her ribs. Karn treated it himself, packing it and wrapping her middle in linen bandages. It stopped bleeding almost immediately and turned icy. At first, she worried that it wasn't deep enough to kill her, but the way Karn barked orders at everyone told her that he thought it might be. They left her in her bloody fortune-telling clothes, wrapped her in furs, and bundled her into a closed carriage with 3 blackbirds and Karn inside, and more up top and riding alongside. It was snowing heavily and bitter cold. They'd taken her dagger, but she still had the pendant at least. Nobody seemed to notice it in all the fuss about her wound and the mage mark. She tucked it inside the lining of her coat when nobody was looking. She slid a finger in and touched it now and then, wondering how long before that was taken away too. With any luck, she'd be dead before they took it. At first she struggled and kicked, and once almost threw herself out of the carriage while it was moving, but she gradually grew weaker and then slept most of the time, conscious of a creeping chill that gradually took over her body. Karn tried to give her soup and tea, but she resisted and he spilled more than he got into her. It was like she felt every bump of the journey. Once they had to stop to put runners on the carriage to come through the deep snow. Karn swore and pounded his fist on the frame of the carriage. She heard soldiers over her head, shouting travelers off the road. She felt the pressure of Karn's eyes, as if by watching her he could keep her from slipping away. As if he could look into her soul and see what was hidden there. As her body grew colder, the air grew warmer, moister, and filled with the scent of growing things. She didn't know how long they were on the road, but finally one day, as she lay between sleep and waking, she could hear sounds outside the carriage that told her they were in a city. She heard the horses' hooves striking cobblestones and dogs barking. The familiar stench of coal fires burned in her nose, and people were shouting at each other the way they do when they are packed close together. She heard the sound of temple bells overhead. It must be almost solstice, she thought hazily. Perhaps they're taking me somewhere for the holiday. The thought made her smile. It was a large city, because it was another hour before they clattered across a bridge and into the stable yard at the palace. When they opened the door to the carriage, she could smell horse dung. Or was it the river? She knew she must be in Arden's court, the city of her birth. Or, at least, the city where her grandmother had handed her over to the only parents she'd ever known, along with a ruby-hilted dagger and a warning. She wondered if she would find any answers here. She was surprised that they would bring a Delphian patriot this far south to wring answers out of her. Maybe with Claremont gone, they were short of help when it came to torture. They wrapped her up again, and Karn himself carried her into the palace. His face looked haggard, furred with a stubble of beard. On her back as she was, she could see the frowning stone facade stretching above her as she passed beneath it, and the night sky beyond, stained sallow by the lights of the city. 23. The King's Healer. Ash had no idea what time it was when they brought in his breakfast, but it seemed that he'd just laid down his head when he was awakened by the bang and clatter. He took the arrival of the servant as a sign that his audience with the king was scheduled for an early hour, so he reluctantly rolled out of bed. He ached all over, and he still had his cuts and bruises, but he was clean and alive, and he could see, even in the dim light of the banked hearth. That was something to be grateful for. Despite his weariness, he hadn't slept well. Lila's words kept running through his head. "You're an amateur, Sulhan. Don't let the fact that you're a wizard make you overconfident." He'd been ready to attack the king in the barn after Crusher went down, without knowing that he wore a talisman. And then he'd all but lost his temper in the courtyard after healing Haman. He'd have one chance at the king, if he was lucky. He had to make it count. Now that he was in the palace with so many eyes on him, he needed to play it smart. He washed his face using the basin and the mirror. The sunburned look was fading, and his eyes were a little clearer. He pulled his new boots on, being careful of the gash in the back of his leg. They fit perfectly. He ran his fingers through his hair, roughly distributing it, and he was ready. Breakfast was porridge and sliced fruit. There was no bread. He supposed the destroyed kitchen might affect meal preparation in the palace for a while. Ash thought of Haman, wondering how he was doing, and where they had taken him. What had the bakers seen? Had they asked him any questions? Despite his worries, Ash was ravenous, as he always was after a difficult healing, and he ate heartily. All through breakfast he gripped his amulet, feeding it the trickle of power that was all he could manage. Soon he'd have enough to do some real damage. He was just finishing eating when he heard a commotion in the corridor. His door flew open, and 6 blackbirds poured into the room. They were all mages, all collared, and they seemed to be on a mission. One of them shut the door and put his back against it, while the other 5 surrounded Ash. He grabbed for his amulet, but 2 of them pinned his arms before he could touch it. Panic flickered through him again. Had the Darien brothers survived after all? Had they come to take him down to the dungeons? Worse, had Lila betrayed him?
"Relax, boy,"
one of them said.
"There's no point in fighting it. You'll get used to it after a while."
He dug in a carry bag and pulled out a silver collar inscribed with runes. Ash recognized it as one of the flashcraft collars made by the clans during the Wizard Wars, now used by Arden to enslave the gifted. Maybe it was useless to resist, but Ash refused to go quietly into bondage, so it took all 5 of them to pin him to the floor and fasten the thing around his neck. If he'd had more magic on board, maybe it wouldn't have happened at all. By the end, one of the gifted blackbirds had a bloody nose and another a purpling eye, and Ash had a collar around his neck. He crouched in a corner like a wolf at bay, exploring the thing with his hands. He found the catch, which seemed to be welded shut now. He could feel the engraving under his sensitive fingers. It was a wide piece, and he found he had to keep his head upright, or it would bite into his chin or his collarbone. The blackbirds watched him with varying degrees of sympathy, depending on how they'd fared in the wrestling match. Some wouldn't look at him at all. The mage who'd brought the collar extended a hand to help him up. After a moment's hesitation, Ash took it and stood.
"How does it work?"
he asked.
"Does it make it impossible to use magic or what?"
The mage shook his head.
"They want to take advantage of magery. That's the whole point. So they need us to be able to do spellcasting. Here at court, the collars prevent us from using attack magic and killing charms. That's the main limitation." "Do they work on their own, or does somebody have to activate it?" "They work on their own. General Khan has some mage masters who oversee the program and can change the settings when we go into the field. What triggers it? The nature of the charm or the intent? Trying to figure out a way around it, are you? Good luck."
The mage stuck out his hand.
"I'm Mark Desjardins. Call me Mark." "Adam Freeman."
Ash paused.
"You're a southerner, right?"
Mark nodded.
"There are mages in the south, though the Church of Malthus would like to pretend otherwise. For centuries we've been able to survive, as long as we keep our heads down and our magic to ourselves. Until King Gerard found a use for us."
He tapped his own collar with his forefinger.
"Out in the field, these can be used to track our movements, to control our use of attack magic, and to direct our behavior in battle. They're also used to torture or kill a mage that misbehaves."
"Define misbehaves," Ash said.
The mage snorted. "A mage who doesn't follow orders, who tries to escape, who fights back. As long as you do what you're told, they pretty much leave you alone."
Ash saw then that the flesh around Mark's collar was thickened, rough, and badly scarred, as if it had been repeatedly burned in the past. Mark noticed him staring. He smiled crookedly and ran a finger under his collar.
"I used to misbehave a lot," he said. "We'd better go. The king is waiting."
They walked back toward the center of the palace, the council chambers and the king's apartments. The guards had to slow their pace to match Ash's faltering gait. Despite the hour, there were many people about, most of them servants. He didn't draw as many stares as before, because now he was clean and clad in the bark brown of the healers. It seemed the King of Arden liked to sort people by colors. His escort stopped before a door that looked much like any other, except that there was a brace of the king's guards standing in front.
"Prepare to kneel to the king, healer,"
the outside guard muttered, giving him a rough push through the doorway. Mark followed him in. He found himself in a small reception room, sumptuously decorated, with tall windows overlooking the gardens. The king sat finishing breakfast at a small table by the fireplace. Eggs and ham, not babies and kittens, as Ash might have expected. He's just a man, Ash told himself. He can die like anyone else. There were 4 blackbirds in the room, plus Mark. All of them were gifted. He was definitely outnumbered, even if he hadn't been collared, even if the king didn't wear a talisman. But you're in the same room with him, he thought. That's a start. This morning, Montaigne was clad in rather plain clothing, black trousers and a black doublet edged in gold, sturdy boots, his gold necklace with its seal of office. An elaborate dagger was belted at his waist.
Your Majesty, here is Adam Freeman, collared per your command.
Mark took a few steps back so that Ash stood alone. Ash went down on his knee before the king. He didn't rise until Montaigne told him to do so. When he did, Montaigne was leaning back in his chair, toying with the hilt of his dagger, studying him.
You look much more presentable this morning, healer, he said. I trust you suffered no ill effects from your night in custody.
This spoken with the bite of sarcasm.
No, Your Majesty. It was very comfortable,
Ash replied, chin up, eyes straight ahead. With some effort, he unclenched his jaw. Montaigne's lips twitched.
Shall I assume that you were reluctant to take the collar? Do you blame me? A necessary precaution. It shouldn't interfere with your abilities, as long as they are employed in the interests of the crown. Should you stray from that, you will be punished. So I'm told, sire. Since the clothes appear to fit, ask Desjardins to have another set made, so you can wash them now and then.
Thank you for the clothes, Your Majesty. They are much finer than the ones I had. Montaigne raised an eyebrow and straightened his lace cuffs.
It appears a night in the palace has improved your manners as well as your appearance.
I apologize for my behavior last night. I wasn't myself, as often happens after a difficult healing. The king's eyes narrowed, as if he weren't entirely convinced by this performance.
I am glad to see that you have recovered your good sense.
He paused.
I was impressed with what you did with the baker last night. I have a number of skilled healers at court, and I've never seen any of them heal a man so damaged so completely. And without the use of herbs or tonics.
Herbs and tonics are helpful, Your Majesty, Ash said, but I hadn't any.
No, you hadn't.
The king pulled at his earlobe.
Mages have been an integral part of our military for years. Until now, I had not considered the advantages of using them in the healing service. Selectively, of course. So, I'm offering you a new position, beginning today. I would have you join my guild of healers.
So, after weeks of waiting, Ash would finally have the access he'd sought in the beginning. But it came at a price. He brushed his fingers over the collar. It was already becoming a habit. Sometimes he imagined it was cutting off his air.
Thank you, Your Majesty, he said. Merrill is my master healer. He'll put together a kit for you. Any supplies you will need, any herbal preparations and tonics you favor. We ought to be able to provide most anything. If there is a specialty item you need, not commonly available in the realm, address it with Barrowhill.
We've already had that conversation, Your Majesty, Ash said.
Desjardins will explain what we expect from mages who serve the crown.
King Gerard gestured to Mark, standing just behind Ash.
Escort Freeman to the healer's quarters and introduce him to Merrill. Tell him to find the boy space with them.
The healers were housed in a quiet part of the palace that opened onto the service gardens. There was a small library just off the hallway as well, lined with herbals and apothecaries and surgical texts. Ash made a mental note to return there. He had seen more new books to tempt him in 2 days in the palace than he had seen in the last 6 months. As they walked, Mark filled him in. The infirmary served mostly the palace staff and lower-level officials, whose quarters would not function well as a sick room. The nobility who fell ill usually insisted on being treated in the privacy of their own quarters. The infirmary was small, but bright and airy, with a tiled floor and whitewashed walls, and 6 beds lined up against the walls. Everything looked clean to Ash's critical eye. He found most hospitals to be deadly places to be avoided at all costs. Only 1 bed was occupied. Ash could see the bulk of a large man under the blanket, apparently asleep. The attendant went to find Master Merrill. While they waited, Ash made a wish list for his healer's kit. It turned out that he had plenty of time. The master, when he finally appeared, was a tall man with thinning hair and a weak chin, clad in the same drab colors as Ash. Although he was not especially heavy, there was something soft and yielding about him, as if he never did any significant physical work. He made no attempt to hide his irritation.
"Now, what's all this about?"
Merrill looked them over and chose Mark as the one in charge.
"I am in the middle of a complicated extraction, and I don't care to be interrupted." "This is a new healer, Adam Freeman," Mark said, nodding at Ash. "Healer? I choose my own apprentices, and I don't know this boy."
He looked Ash up and down, his face a storm cloud.
"Where did you steal those clothes?"
Then his gaze fastened on the silver collar, and he made the sign of Malthus.
"You've brought me a mage?"
He poked a finger into Desjardins' face.
"I won't have your kind in my service. I'm not in need of any more help anyway. I've trouble enough with the apprentices I have."
"King Gerard has ordered that Freeman be admitted to the Royal Guild of Healers," Desjardins said evenly.
"Do you wish me to carry your objections to His Majesty?"
The commotion had disturbed the patient in the bed. He stirred and sat up, rubbing his eyes. They went wide when they lit on Ash.
"Adam! By the Maker, you're here! I can't believe what they've been telling me."
It was Haman. The night baker stretched out his arms toward Ash, and a big tear rolled down his face.
"They say I was dead for sure, and you saved my life. They say you rescued me from the fire, and then you healed me. They say it was a miracle. Come here, my boy, so I can feel of you, for surely you were the instrument of holy Malthus in this."
Reluctantly, Ash moved to the bedside and endured the baker's embrace. Now that Merrill understood who Ash was, he looked even less happy.
"You're the stable boy,"
he snapped, as if it were an accusation. Haman was still babbling.
"I remember bringing the oil up from the cellar. I must have let it slip. I just don't remember. But things are going to be different from now on, praise the Maker. I've sworn it off, I tell you. I'm a changed man."
Ash realized that Haman was blaming himself and his drinking for the fire.
"You'll be fortunate if His Majesty doesn't throw you in prison," Merrill said sourly.
Haman ignored him.
"All day long people have been coming in to see me, to look at my back. I'm famous. And to think I was healed by a stable boy. Wait till they hear that you're working here."
Ash was beginning to understand the source of Merrill's murderous bad humor. The master fixed Ash with the haughty gaze of a saint confronting a sinner.
"From what I heard, it was sorcery."
He pointed a warning finger at the baker.
"'Tis a poor bargain if you've traded the integrity of your body for the future of your immortal soul."
That was when Ash noticed the emblem of the rising sun of Malthus dangling from a chain about the master's neck. So the healer was a churchman, a not uncommon wedding of professions in Arden.
"No, no, it was a blessing, Master Merrill," Haman insisted. "I have never felt so close to the faith as I do now." "It couldn't have been much of a burn," Merrill said, scowling. "It is nearly healed." "It was monstrous big," Haman said, leaning forward. "Rolly, he said I was burnt to the bone. He saw it with his own eyes." His Majesty would like you to put together a kit for Freeman, Mark said, and provide a place for him to stay. The boy won't need a kit, Merrill grumbled. He's not qualified to do any actual healing.
Ash was accustomed to working with oversized egos from his time with Master Vega in the Fells.
I know you're busy, Master Merrill, he said, holding up his list. I just need a few things to get started. I can put it together myself if you tell me where things are, and I'll be happy to do any necessary extractions as well.
Merrill snatched the list from Ash.
I don't want a stable boy mucking around in my formulary.
He scanned the list and looked up, surprised.
How did you... My mother taught me about herbs and medicinals, and I had some training at the academy. It will take a while to put this together.
The healer seemed resigned to it.
Wait here.
He disappeared into the rear. Ash returned to Hayman's bedside.
As long as I'm here, why don't I take a look at your back? Are you still in any pain?
He thought it better to examine his patient in Merrill's absence. Hayman obligingly lifted up his shirt and turned his back to Ash.
It's still tender, like a scald, maybe. Not much worse than that.
Ash pushed lightly on the skin and watched with satisfaction as the blood returned.
Have they put anything on it? Some kind of ointment,
the baker said over his shoulder. Aloe, probably. That's what it smelled like.
I don't think you'll have any scarring. Make sure you drink plenty of water. Keep a pitcher by your bed, and empty 4 before the day is over. Eat as much as you can. No alcohol at all for now. If it suddenly seems worse, or there's any new drainage or swelling, any fever, get word to me.
Years of training were reasserting themselves. I'll be here instead of the stable from now on. Hayman nodded solemnly, committing the instructions to memory. Ash hesitated, then said,
Hayman, do you know if anyone else was hurt in the fire?
He was immediately sorry, because the big man teared up again.
I don't know. I hope not. Nobody told me if they were.
He shook his head sadly.
It's all my fault.
Ash put a hand on his shoulder.
You can't be sure you had anything to do with the fire. Fires break out all the time, especially in a kitchen, and there were flammables stored in the basement. Maybe you just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe, Hayman said grudgingly. And you happened to be in the right place. I see you burned your face rescuing me. I'll pray to St. Malthus for you every night.
Ash's discomfort grew as the baker went on. Merrill made them wait another good long time. Finally, he returned with a tray and a cloth sack. The tray held numerous small bags and glass bottles. There was also linen for bandaging and small surgical tools. Ash set the tray down on a table. Then he took the list and ran through the items on the tray, matching them and putting them into the cloth sack. He uncorked the bottles and sniffed them and tasted some, and opened the drawstring bags, sometimes shaking a bit of dried herb onto his palm. Merrill waited impatiently, clearly annoyed that his new apprentice was rechecking his work. Finally, Ash looked up at Merrill and extended his palm toward him with a bit of brown root-like material. This is water hemlock. I asked for chamomile. Merrill stared at him, his mouth opening and closing. Then he snatched back the bag.
Those blasted apprentices! I'll have their hides for this.
If you'd like, I can go into the garden and find it, Ash offered. The healer furiously shook his head.
I'll be back. The leaves and flowers, not the root, Ash called after him. What's water hemlock? Mark whispered.
Poison, Ash replied calmly. The master healer was quick this time. Ash finished putting his bag together and thanked him.
We don't have any rooms to spare, boy, the master healer warned. You'll have to share.
That's all right, Ash replied. I'm used to that. Frankly, he would have felt more at ease in the stable than in the palace, between the Darien brother and his hostile new master. "My name is Adam," he added, with little hope that Merrill would ever actually use it. Merrill ignored him. "You can bring your things over any time. You'll be sharing with Harold and Boyd. I'll expect you to be ready to work this afternoon." "I don't really have anything to bring. I can start to work now." "As you wish," Merrill said. "You can start in the garden, since you fancy yourself an expert at telling one plant from another."
24. An early morning summons. Ash shared a tiny room in back of the extraction laboratory with 2 other apprentices, both much younger than him. Harold and Boyd seemed surprised to be teamed with someone who was nearly grown. Over a period of days, as they realized how knowledgeable he was, they began turning to him for guidance when they had a question. Merrill wasn't much of a teacher. He seemed to be threatened by anyone with a smattering of talent or skill. Ash was happy to help them, but only when Merrill wasn't around. The apprentices were expected to clean the extraction lab and set up materials for the master healers. When the lab was in use, their sleeping room was almost unbearable because of the odors, so Ash spent very little time there. Since the healers' quarters were out of the way, it was more difficult to keep track of events in and around the palace, but Ash was just as happy to lay low, in case more Darien brothers came looking for him. After days passed and there was no sign of them, he began to relax a little. It was possible the priest who'd spotted him had kept it to himself, not wanting to share with his brothers. Ash had hoped that a position in the healing halls would give him better access to the king, but that didn't happen. When he asked Harold and Boyd who took care of the king, they said Montaigne hadn't called for a healer since they'd been there.
"He's never sick?" Ash asked.
"If he is, he don't call on us," Harold said.
The nobility, including the Ardenine Thanes, were treated in their own quarters by the master healers. Apprentices often went along to assist, but Ash was never invited. The other healers gave him a wide berth, making the sign of Malthus if he got too close. Much of Ash's assigned work consisted of cleanup, the harvesting and drying of plants, the chopping of roots and grinding of herbs with a mortar and pestle. Tasks he'd been doing for Taliesin since he was 12. Sometimes he was allowed to pour off and label extractions after they were made. He suspected that Merrill didn't want to give Ash another chance to demonstrate what he could do. Once Haman was released from the infirmary, however, there came a steady stream of servants, soldiers, and minor officials with illnesses and injuries, asking for Adam Freeman. Apparently, now that the baker was on the loose, he was spreading the good news. Master Merrill's annoyance was tempered by the fact that he had no interest in treating the riffraff. Eventually, a patient was admitted with dysentery, and Ash was assigned to bathe the unfortunate and change his bed. Merrill seemed to delight in finding menial tasks to keep him busy. So, unless the King of Arden needed his toenails trimmed, they were unlikely to meet again. Ash had retrieved his death-dealing formulary from the stables. He hid it carefully under a stone in the garden and protected it with a charm. He was at a loss for how to use it. He could tamper with the food down in the kitchens, but there was no guarantee any of it would make its way to his target. The king had a taster. Those who shared the palace with him did not. Innocent people would die, the kitchen staff would pay the price, and the king would go on living. The same applied to the herbs and medicinals in the healer's formulary. Unless he could get his hands on an order specifically for the king, he was unlikely to succeed by that route. Taliesin always said that using poison in a crowd was like shooting a bolt into the sky, not knowing where it would land. Anyway, Merrill kept a hawk's eye on Ash, waiting for him to make a misstep. Ash had no doubt that any problem would be laid directly at his door. One morning, about a fortnight after Ash had moved to the healer's quarters, He was setting up and labeling the solvents and diluents, using the compounding recipes while the two younger boys gathered materials from the storeroom in the rear. Master Merrill was away, and the two apprentices were eager to tell him why.
"Did you hear what happened last night?"
Harold said, dumping an armload of herbs onto the table.
"With Lady Estelle and all."
Ash shook his head, distracted. He was counting out measures of willow bark.
"No, I didn't hear."
Lady Estelle was the king's current favorite, and Harold and Boyd were unrepentant gossips. Ash really didn't care who was carrying the king's chance child.
"Last night the king all but climbed in bed with a viper."
That caught Ash's interest.
"A viper? How could that happen?" "From all I heard, it was a death-sting adder," Harold went on. "They're only big around as your little finger, but if one bites you, you're a goner."
A snake was in his rooms? Harold shook his head.
"Like I said, it was in the Lady Estelle's suite."
Ash abandoned all pretense of working.
"Was the king bitten?"
he asked with a spark of hope.
"I don't think so. King Gerard, he ran out of the room, shouting for his guard. 5 blackbirds went in and tore the bed apart looking for it, and finally killed it. Lady Estelle and all her ladies, they were hysterical."
Ash sat down on the bed, heart thumping.
"How do you know all this?" "Master Merrill took me with him to help carry. He thought he'd need help, what with 5 women all carrying on."
Harold was beside himself with delight at being the bearer of such important news, while Boyd looked glum at being left out.
"Master Merrill is treating the king?"
"Ha, no danger of a cure there." Harold shook his head, as if Ash were a little thick.
"Nah, I told you, the king, it's like he don't believe in healers. I mean the ladies. They was in a frenzy, and we had no ladies' tonic made up, so we give 'em enough brandy to put a sapper on his back. Then the king's guard, they come in, and they have at Lady Estelle and the ladies, asking 'em all kinds of questions, only they wasn't making much sense by this time, and the guard, they want us to sober 'em up again."
Harold lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper.
"See, they're thinking the snake was meant for the king."
Who would want to hurt the king? Ash might have sounded a little sarcastic, but it went right by Harold and Boyd. Do they have any suspects?
"Well, I don't guess they'd tell Harold if they did,"
Boyd broke in, eager to participate.
"Well, after the guards left, Lady Estelle and her ladies were all in a panic because it seemed like the blackbirds thought maybe they was in on it."
"Where was the king all this time?"
"He went back to his suite, far as I know."
Just then they heard a footstep in the hallway. Boyd and Harold hurried to look busy, thinking maybe it was Master Merrill. But it was Mark Desjardins.
"Freeman, get your kit and come with me. The king has asked for you."
Ash tried to read Mark's face, but got nothing.
"He asked for me specifically."
The mage nodded. Was it possible the king had been bitten after all? With mingled apprehension and anticipation, Ash set his work aside and washed his hands. He retrieved his kit from under his bed.
"Wait here," he said. "I need to get something from the garden, just in case I need it."
Blessedly, they didn't follow him out there. He knelt behind a low wall, lifted the stone, and pulled out his hidden saddlebag. Running his fingers over the packets and bottles inside, he chose 2 small bottles. The first he tucked into a pocket he'd sewn into his sleeve. The other he slid into a mesh pouch he'd attached to the inside of the silver collar. Even if he came under suspicion, they were unlikely to take the collar off. On his way back inside, he plucked a fistful of snakebite weed. Harold was eagerly filling a visibly uncomfortable Mark in on the details in Lady Estelle's suite.
"You'd best watch yourself, Harold," Mark said. "It seems to me they're trying to keep that whole thing quiet. You don't want the king to hear that you're spreading that story."
It was almost comical the way Harold's mouth snapped shut and a look of panic crowded onto his face. Almost.
"Can you two finish setting up?" Ash asked his two young colleagues.
They both nodded, staring at him, wide-eyed, unsure whether Ash was in trouble or in luck.
"If Master Merrill is looking for me, tell him I've been summoned by the king. I don't know how long I'll be."
Ash figured he might as well take his time. Merrill would make his life miserable for the next week regardless.
"What's this all about?"
Ash demanded as they hurried back toward the center of the castle. Mark shook his head.
"I don't really know, but the entire palace is crawling with the king's guard. I've never seen anything like it. If what Harold says is true, they're taking the snake episode seriously."
That was certainly true. As they approached the king's apartments, the blackbirds flocked thicker.
"The only other rumor I've heard is about plague," Mark said. "Plague? Here in Ardenscourt?"
Mark shook his head.
"Delphi. Word is that riders came in from the north a few hours ago. Blackbirds escorting a closed carriage. Nobody knows anything. Also unusual. Maybe some visitor needs healing." "Why would they bring plague to Ardenscourt?" "Maybe it's someone really important. That's why it's such a secret."
It still doesn't make sense. Ash thought of the city, teeming with people, and the consequences if the plague were loosed here with no gifted healers to treat it.
"All I know is this morning he sent for me early and told me to fetch you, that it was urgent."
This might be the opportunity I've been looking for, Ash thought, unless they just need somebody to make the beds. The guards seemed to be expecting them and admitted them quickly after the usual search. Ash saw immediate signs of heightened security. There were 10 fully armed blackbirds inside, along with Montaigne, Lila, and another man Ash had never seen before, an uncollared mage. He and Lila had their heads together over a map spread out on the hearth. Ash studied the king, looking for signs of illness, but saw none, only evidence of murderous foul humor. The stranger looked to be the same age as Ash, with a lean, muscular build, hazel eyes, a stubble of reddish beard, and brown hair. His clothing was travel-stained, as if he'd been on the road for days and hadn't had time to change. Was this his patient? Ash guessed not. The mage appeared worried, almost agitated, but Ash sensed no physical disorder about him. When they entered the room, Lila and the stranger broke off their conversation. He leaned forward, hands on his knees, examining Ash with sharp interest. Should I offer him the secret wizard handshake? Ash thought.
"Lieutenant Karn!" Mark exclaimed. "You're back!"
Karn! Ash all but missed a step.
"Good to be back,"
the young man said, his gaze flicking to Mark, then back to Ash. This must be Destin Karn, the Ardenine spy master. Ash had heard his name during his travels through Arden. The son of Marin Karn, general of the Ardenine armies. He could have been the one behind the attack on him at Odin's Ford. If so, would Karn recognize him? Tall and red-haired were the descriptors most often applied to Ash. At least now his hair was dyed a muddy brown color. Just another friend of Lila's, apparently. Ash was beginning to feel hemmed in by Lila's friends.
"That will be all, Lila,"
Gerard said, gesturing toward the door. Lila looked from the king to Ash, her lips tightening. Ash could tell she was hot to stay, but she curtsied a farewell just the same.
"When you're free, Lieutenant, come to see me in the quartermaster's office. I should be there most of the day, arranging for the wagons."
Karn nodded. "Let's talk tonight. I need to get a few things done here before we leave." Leave for where? Ash wondered. Did this have to do with whatever scheme she was working on? As Lila departed, Ash knelt and then rose to his feet.
"You wish to see me, Your Majesty?" "This is the healer I told you about, Karn," Montaigne said, nodding toward Ash. Have him take a look at the girl if you really think we need a second opinion, but I think you're worrying unnecessarily. Merrill said that she would mend, given rest and a little time. He offered to bleed her if need be. I would be pleased to examine your patient, Ash blurted. If you wish, sire. Ash had a low opinion of Merrill's opinion, and it might be another opportunity to win the trust of the king. Karn unfolded to his feet and walked toward Ash, moving gracefully like a cat. "Where are you from?" he said to Ash, his eyes fastening on his collar. Maybe I should get a decorative scarf to cover it. "Tamron," Ash said. "From your speech, I would have guessed you were from farther north." Ash stiffened. He should have expected the spymaster would be familiar with the accent. Karn had probably tortured his share of military prisoners, but Ash hadn't realized he still had one. "My mother was from the Fells, but I've never wanted to go. They say there are monsters there." "There are monsters here, healer," Karn said. "You're right about that," Ash said to himself. "About the patient, is it plague, your majesty?" "Plague?" King Gerard raised an eyebrow. "Why would you think of plague?" "They say there's plague in Delphi," Ash said, acutely aware of the weight of the bottle in his sleeve. If it's a concern, I have a tisane that might protect you if taken early. I could make up some now and—" "Who told you I came from Delphi?" Karn interrupted, eyes narrowed. "No one, sir," Ash said, not wanting to involve Mark. "Get hold of yourself, Sulhan," he thought. "I think this collar is cutting off the blood to your brain." "I heard that travelers had arrived from the north, and I assumed—" "It's not plague," Karn snapped. "It's a 16-year-old girl with a stab wound." He rolled up the map and slid it into its case. "We need someone who can keep whatever he sees to himself," the king said. "Can you do that, Freeman?" "Of course, your majesty," Ash said. "Thank you for your confidence in me." "We would be most distressed," Karn said, "if word were to leak out about this. Do you understand?" The lieutenant's hand crept to the knife at his belt, making the implied threat explicit. "I understand, Lieutenant Karn." Ash's curiosity burned hotter. Who was this patient? Why was it such a secret? Had he been chosen for this task because he was considered expendable? That's when he put the pieces together. This patient, a 16-year-old girl, had come from the north in a closed carriage. It was a big secret he needed to keep to himself. Lys. His heart stuttered and then began to pound. It was like he couldn't get a breath. Maybe she'd been wounded, taken prisoner, and brought here. Ash breathed in, breathed out, struggling to still himself. After the attack at Odin's Ford, he knew Montaigne was targeting his family. He knew, and yet he'd whiled away his time in a stable. He should have acted sooner. He should have found a way to stop the king before this happened. If it is Lys, he thought, I will find a way to save her. Unbidden, Talison's words came back to him. The time will come when you will wish that you were a better healer. Healer? Karn tilted his head, frowning. Is there a problem? No, Lieutenant, Ash said, his gut churning. No problem at all. 25. In the King's Dungeons. They left the King's apartments with 2 blackbirds in tow, using the first available staircase to descend to the cellar level. Karn led the way, with Ash in the middle and the guards behind. They wound their way into the heart of the castle until they came to a stout wooden door sunken into the wall, blackbirds to either side. Behind the door, another staircase descended to a level beneath the cellar.
Ash couldn't help recalling his last visit to the cellars with the blood-sucking Darien priest. "You keep your patients in the cellar?" he said, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Karn gave him a long, measuring look. "This patient we do," he said, pointing down the staircase. "This way." At the foot of the stairs, there was another door, a metal one this time, and 2 more guards before it. The guards saluted the lieutenant, eyed Ash, and ushered them through. The door clanged shut behind them, and when Ash heard the bar being thrown, his suspicions were confirmed. They were in the King of Arden's dungeons. Claustrophobia settled over him like a shroud. If it was Liz, how could he possibly get her out of here, especially if she was injured? And if these Southerners ever became aware of who he was, he would be killed or clapped into the cell next to her. Imprisoned and tortured, most likely. The son and daughter of the Queen of the Fells would be worth more alive than dead. Ash slid a finger under his collar, touched the bottle hidden there. He knew how to get dead if he needed to. They walked through a dark stone corridor just wide enough for 2 to pass abreast, poorly illuminated by torches stuck into niches in the wall. The floor was uneven underfoot, carelessly excavated in some remote age. The air was dank and stale, as if it had been rebreathed so many times that there was nothing nourishing in it. There were doors to either side of the corridor, with high barred windows, none large enough to get a man's shoulders through. He heard sounds from some of them, wounded sounds and weeping, the repetitive wailing of the insane. Ash quickly turned away. You can't save everyone, Sulhan, he thought. The floor sloped downward, and they passed through 2 more checkpoints with guards. They took several turns until they were in an area where the doors were farther apart, suggesting the cells were larger. Although they were farther underground, the air seemed better there, too. He noticed ventilation shafts driven through at intervals. Most of the cells in this area seemed to be empty. At the end of the corridor was a large circular room with a high ceiling and 3 doors set in the stone around the perimeter. At the far end of the room was a crumbling stone wall, stained and damaged by the wet, layered with fungus. Water trickled off it and pooled on the floor. Ash guessed that meant they were close to the river. There were 2 large stone slabs in the central room, leather straps attached with iron rings, stained dark from long use and indifferent cleaning. Wrought metal chains and pulleys and leg irons dangled from the walls. Ash didn't recognize the tools he saw there, but many of them bore an uncanny resemblance to medical instruments. The room stank of old blood, intentional pain, and terror. He took a deep breath, released it in a long shudder. "Nervous, healer?" Karn gave him a sideways look. "Feeling the damp is all," Ash said, his mouth ashy with fear. There were 2 guards stationed outside one of the doors in the far wall, a door with no window. This must be their destination. If it was Liz, would she recognize him? He'd changed a lot in 4 years, and his hair was dyed brown, and yet they had been so close, the connection between them so strong that she might. What if she did and called him by name? What if he saw what had been done to her and gave himself away? He could not allow that to happen. The guards unlocked the door and stepped aside so they could enter. "Stay outside," Karn ordered the blackbirds. He lifted 2 torches from sconces on either side of the door and led the way in. The room was dimly lit by lamps set into niches in the walls. Their light didn't make it all the way into the corners. The cell was roughly 20 feet square, hollowed out of stone and emptied of furniture. The ceiling was higher than in the upper part of the dungeon. On the far side of the room, a low bed had been set up against the wall. There, on the bed, under a pile of blankets, someone was dying. That understanding slammed into Ash like a runaway horse, all but forcing the air from his lungs. Karn mounted the torches and sconces on the wall at either end of the bed.
"Hello, Jenna," he said softly. "We've brought another healer for you."
Jenna, not Liz. And when he looked at the girl huddled in the bed, he realized that she was a stranger. Ash all but crumpled to the floor, his relief mingled with confusion. If it wasn't Liz, then who was she?
"Healer?"
Karn was eyeing him again like he didn't know what to make of this wobble-kneed mage. The prisoner watched them warily as they approached, like an animal in a trap. It was a girl, perhaps a little younger than Ash, a rough gray blanket pulled up to her chin. Her hair was tangled and appeared to be streaked with color. It was hard to tell, it was so badly in need of washing. Her clothes were filthy, too, though they'd once been fine. She wore what looked like boys' breeches and a torn linen shirt stained with blood, and only the gods knew what else. A velvet coat lay crumpled up on the floor next to the bed. Her hands were manacled together, attached to a bolt in the wall by a short chain. The skin at her wrists was scabbed and discolored, as if she'd struggled to get free. Ash's fingers found the collar around his own neck, and his stomach clenched with sympathy. Her eyes, though, they were a striking gold color, clear and piercing, set into a planed face with a rather prominent nose. Raptor's eyes that missed nothing, undefeated in a place intended to extinguish hope. She wasn't the kind who could survive long in captivity, even if she hadn't sustained a mortal wound. His heart broke a little.
"The first healer said I'd be fine."
Her voice was weak and thready, but there was an element of steel in it.
"I thought he was the best you had."
"Meryl said you wouldn't let him come anywhere near you," Karn said. Smart girl, Ash thought.
The girl shifted on the bed, bunching the blanket in her fists.
"Is that what he said? He's a liar, then."
"Jenna,"
Karn muttered, as if frustrated.
"Anyway, he said he didn't need to touch me. He could diagnose me by my aura."
"Blood of the martyrs," Karn said through gritted teeth. "I'm trying to save your life." He gestured toward Ash. "This one is gifted."
Jenna looked Ash up and down, and something like fear flickered in her eyes.
"No,"
she said, licking her cracked lips.
"He's too tall. I don't want a tall healer. Bring me someone else."
She doesn't want a gifted healer, Ash thought. Is she worried that I might actually succeed in healing her? Or is she afraid that I'll ferret out secrets that she wants to keep hidden? Ash squatted in front of her, setting his kit down beside him, so he could take a closer, appraising look. Her eyes were overbright, her breathing quick and shallow. Likely her pulse was rapid, too. He could feel a blaze of white-hot magic centered in her midsection. That must be where the injury was. The girl was not a wizard. She had no telltale glow. Her arms were well muscled, like she worked hard for a living. She'd eaten well, too, at least until recently. Her skin had an unusual reflective quality. It shimmered in the light from the torches as if there were flames under her skin.
"I'm Adam Freeman," he said. "How do you feel?"
Jenna gazed into his face for a long moment.
"You are a wolf,"
she said, her lip curling. She looked up at Karn.
"Why did you bring a wolf into the palace?"
That was like a punch to the gut. Once again, Ash tasted fear, like metal in his mouth. Why had she said that? How could she possibly know? The last thing he needed was to be tied to the Grey Wolf line.
"What do you mean, Jenna?"
Karn demanded, looking from the girl on the bed to Ash.
"What do you mean he's a wolf?"
"The lieutenant doesn't know, does he?
Jenna said, smirking like a cat with a bird in its mouth. She breathed in sharply, like she was tasting his scent.
Now I have made you sweat, wolf.
She brought both hands up, put her finger to her lips.
Shh,
she said, then slumped back onto her pillows and rolled onto her side, facing the wall, so Ash was staring at her back. It seemed that his patient had been doing an assessment of her own.
Well, Karn shifted impatiently. Are you going to get to work or not?
Ash rose to his feet and broadened his stance.
She needs to be moved upstairs. She needs fresh air and light.
Karn folded his arms and shook his head.
That's not going to happen, healer. You'll have to do the best you can right here. At least unchain her so I can examine her properly, and you need to leave. I'm not going anywhere. If she can speak to me in confidence, maybe she'll be more cooperative.
I don't want to speak to you at all, Jenna said to the wall. Both of you, go away.
Karn looked from Ash to Jenna and back again, as if he were debating whose side he was on.
Why should I trust you alone with her? He said finally. I don't know anything about you. The king's word isn't enough.
Ash raised an eyebrow. Karn just looked at him for a long moment, then said,
Step outside. I need a word with you.
He jerked his head toward the door. As soon as they stepped out into the interrogation chamber, Karn turned, quick as thought, and pinned Ash against the wall, his knife pressed into the hollow of Ash's throat, just below the collar. Ash saw it coming, but he let it happen, because he knew by then that the lieutenant needed Jenna healed, and he would not kill Ash to make a point.
Why did she call you a wolf? The lieutenant demanded. What did she mean by that?
Ash should have known that Karn hadn't forgotten. He thought of claiming that Jenna was confused, but he had a feeling that Karn wouldn't buy. The lieutenant knew something about his prisoner that made him take her words seriously.
I'm not going to talk with a knife to my throat, Ash said, meeting Karn's gaze. It won't make any difference anyway.
Karn stared at him for a long moment, then lowered the knife and took a step back.
I think it means she's smart, Ash said. She wants to die, and she's afraid I might succeed in healing her where Merrill failed. If she can plant enough suspicion to make you pull me off the case, she'll get what she wants. She does want to die, Karn said grudgingly. She stabbed herself. That's why she's so uncooperative. We need to keep her alive, at least until... We need to keep her alive.
If she wants to die, Ash thought, then maybe I should let her. But he guessed it wouldn't be wise to say that aloud.
If you want to keep her alive, then I'll need some answers from you.
Karn frowned as if he were surprised to hear a healer snapping out orders.
Such as? Do you have the weapon?
For a few heartbeats, Karn seemed to be debating. Then, fumbling in his carry bag, he pulled out a dagger in a sheath and extended it, hilt first, toward Ash. Ash pulled the blade from its covering and looked it over. It was magicked, but the spells used were unfamiliar to him, like a fragment of song from a faraway place. It was still smudged with blood.
Is this her blood? Hers and someone else's.
Karn cleared his throat.
Yours? No, one of the guardsmen in Delphi. He's dead. She killed him the night we found her. Is that why she's here? Because she murdered a guardsman? That's not your concern. Where did the dagger come from?
Karn shook his head.
She had it on her person.
He looked like he was going to add something else, then changed his mind.
How long ago was she wounded? 5 days. How was it treated? I cleaned it, packed it, and applied a dressing. Ash nodded. Good. Did it bleed much? To start with, it did.
Karn said, but it closed up quickly. It's swollen. I think it might be infected, or something. Or something. Has she been eating and drinking? Karn shook his head. Not much. All right. Ash handed the dagger back to Karn, who weighed it in his hand. Well, can you heal her? I'm not Meryl, Ash said. I can't tell without examining her. But I'm not familiar with the magic in the blade. If I had to guess, I'd say it was from outside the 7 realms. A muscle twitched in Karn's jaw, but he said nothing. Given that, and given the delay in treatment, I'm not optimistic. Listen to me. Karn leaned in close. You say you're a healer, but I know you're a mage from somewhere to the north of us. Maybe you're working for the king, and maybe you're working for the witch in the north, and maybe you're working for somebody else entirely. Maybe you're a miraculous healer, and maybe this girl is as good as dead. But what you need to understand is that if she dies, it doesn't matter whether the king recommended you or not. It will be our fault, and we will both pay the price. I never expected anything less from His Majesty, Ash said. I'm one of only 2 people in the Empire who might possibly save her life. I'll do my best, whether you're watching me or not. But I might get some helpful information if you stay out here. It's up to you, but I'm going to need all the help I can get. 26. The Wolf Healer. So the Wolf Healer is supposed to be the kind one, Jenna thought, still staring at the wall. The one she might confide in after holding out stubbornly all this time. They played their roles flawlessly, bad lieutenant and good healer. Then they both went out the door to conspire together. Perhaps the boy was chosen for his looks. He was tall and well-built, with broad shoulders, muscular arms, and large hands, like a young predator coming of age. He wore the same brown clothing as the other healer, but he filled it differently. He had a long, solemn face, his coppery skin framing deep blue-green eyes that spoke of a mongrel ancestry. His hair was an odd, muddy brown, though, which didn't fit with his reddish eyebrows and the bit of stubble on his face. He was a mage. An aura of power framed him, a diffusion of light more brilliant than Karn's. That and the silver collar told her that he served the monster king. The gifted were never turned to healing, not in Arden. He's probably just another blackbird, someone with a talent for ferreting secrets out of the weak and gullible. When she glimpsed him out of the corner of her eye, she saw wolves, gray wolves with razored teeth and brilliant eyes, loping across the blue-shadowed snow. His feral scent reminded Jenna of the witch wind that blew down from the Spirit Mountains during the cold moon. That must mean he's a killer, she thought. He's ruthless, that's all. She heard the door open, then 2 sets of footsteps crossing the room. Roll over, Jenna, Karn said brusquely, so I can unlock your hands. That surprised her enough that she rolled onto her back to look up at him. He reached across and unlocked the manacles from her wrist, allowing them to clang back against the wall. He stood staring down at her for a long moment, as if he wanted to say something, then left again, closing the door behind him. Meanwhile, the wolf pulled up a stool next to her bed and set a bag on the floor by his feet, making himself at home. Lieutenant Khan is going to bring some hot water and soap so I can clean out your wound. She saw no point in objecting, knowing it would do no good. Is it all right if I call you Jenna? He asked. If I can call you Wolf, she said. He scowled, gritting his teeth. Could you please call me Adam?
All right, she said. I will try and think of you as a wolf called Adam.
So, Jenna, Adam Wolf said, like he just had to try it out. What exactly happened to you?
Why do you care?
He seemed stuck for a moment. You're a person, he said finally.
Well, this person wants you to go away.
I can't do that, he said. He paused, and when she didn't have a comeback, leaned forward again. Tell me about the dagger. It seems to be magecraft. Where did you get it?
Tell me about your collar,
she said, pretending to look up at the ceiling, but watching him out of the corner of her eye.
That's magecraft too. Does the king have a leash for you as well?
It wasn't my idea, the healer muttered, scowling.
So we have a bond, you and I, both being leashed by the king, and now I'll reveal all my secrets. Is that the idea?
He shook his head, his jaw tightening as anger rose from him like mist. The wolf was like a tapestry. The surface he presented was calm, tightly woven, but underlain by dark threads of violence. I don't need to know all your secrets, he said. Just the ones that will help me do my job.
For a healer, she said, still pushing, you have a very dark soul.
He flinched back as if he'd been caught in a lie, and rubbed the back of his neck. One of my teachers once told me that healers stand astride the line between life and death. Maybe that's why. He paused, and when she didn't respond, said, Why are you the king's prisoner?
They seem to think I blew up some stuff, and set fire to some stuff, and maybe gave away some secrets.
She didn't mean to admit to anything unless she was forced to. Why did you stab yourself with your own dagger?
It seemed like a good idea at the time.
Adam's lips twitched, and he almost smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. It looked good on him. Why is it so important to them to keep you alive?
They don't want me to die before they torture me into naming some names. Then they'll execute me, which is why healing me is a waste of everyone's time.
She stole a look at him. From the stubborn look on his face, she knew he wasn't going to cooperate. Thank you for answering my questions, he said politely. Now, I'm going to examine you. Don't worry, he said when she shrank back. This won't hurt. It's not complicated. His eyes met hers, catching and holding. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached out and took both her hands, his fingers blazing hot against her frozen skin, his thumbs planted on the pulse points of her wrists. She tried to pull free, but his grip was too strong. She gritted her teeth, steeling herself against whatever magery he would use against her. At first, she felt only a gentle tendril of something, like a shaft of sunlight leaking through a canopy of cloud, warming her a bit. Then the channels opened between them, and images flooded through from both sides, brilliant, heartbreaking, the unvarnished truth, colliding and entangling and mingling so that it was hard to tell whose was whose, what was real and what was conjury. She saw wolves again, like gray spirits haunting the twisting streets of a mountain town. Little Maggie, tossed aside like a broken toy. A small, fierce woman with copper skin and green eyes, pacing, smacking her fist into her palm. Riley's eyes, locked with hers, his blood steaming when it hit the snow. A solemn-faced, red-haired boy, holding hands with a weeping little girl, while grim-faced, blue-jacketed guards marched by, carrying flower-decked biers. The deeps of the mine, the scent of damp stone, and darkness as impenetrable as a shroud. A dagger with a dragon hilt, its blade smeared with blood, a fair-haired man lying on slushy cobblestones. The red-haired boy knelt next to him, clutching a pendant carved in the shape of a serpent. her own father's blood soaking into the tavern floor, the perfect whoosh as the mudback warehouse went up in flames, the bedrock shaking as the munitions inside blew. A lone wolf with savage, wounded eyes, keeping to the shadows, scales and claws that glittered in the sun. She stole a look at the healer. Adam Wolf sat as if mesmerized, lips slightly parted, memories and dreams swimming in the ocean of his eyes, his face changing as each one burrowed into his heart. He sees it too, she thought, amazed. He sees me. That had never happened before. Shared grief and loss, unquenchable rage and vengeance, familiar, connecting the two of them in 100 ways. There was no going back. She'd given too much away. She was vulnerable to him now, but it didn't seem like a bad thing, because he was vulnerable to her. The wolf was the one who broke it off. He jerked his hands back and stared at her with the most peculiar expression on his face, like he was looking into a mirror and seeing himself reflected back. "What the hell?" he whispered, his voice thick and unfamiliar. "You tell me, Wolf," she said, blotting tears from her eyes with her sleeve. "What the bloody hell?" She sank back into the bedclothes, trembling. How was that not complicated? Just like that, she was done sparring with the healer. In a world full of villains, she didn't have to know exactly who and what he was in order to know that he was not the enemy. Adam wet his lips and flexed his shoulders as if to relieve the tension there. Stole a look at the door as if planning his escape. What did you do to me? What does it mean?" "It means that we're done lying to each other," she said. "There's no point. All right?" She looked into his eyes, but saw no agreement there, only a new wariness, as if he'd never expected to be ambushed by his patient. And then the shutters closed. He's scared he's revealed too much. "Didn't you see what I saw? Didn't you? If you know the truth, you have to honor it." She wanted to shake him, but the conversation was wearing her out. The edges of her consciousness were crumbling away, like the fragile pages of an old manuscript, like wolves breaking away from the pack. The door banged open, and in came Karn with a basin and rags, a fistful of linen strips, and a pot of steaming water. "Am I interrupting something?" he said, looking at the two of them with their heads together. He clunked the supplies down next to the bed. The wolf blinked at him, as if breaking out of a dream. He gently rocked the pot of water so it sloshed. "Did you really boil this for 10 minutes? Isn't that what you said?" Karn gave them both a pointed look, then went and sat against the wall by the door, so he could watch what went down from a distance. With Karn in the room, the healer left off questioning her and got down to business. He pulled the pot of water closer, tipping some of the contents into the basin. "Jenna, I'm going to clean out your wound a bit and see what's going on. Then we'll decide what to do." "We?" That brought forth smile number 2. Almost.
"Are you able to sit up, if I help?"
She nodded. Gripping her hands again, he gently pulled her upright, turning her so her feet dangled over the edge of the bed. She clutched her bedclothes under her chin, like they were a fort she could hide in. Her head began spinning, and black spots danced before her eyes. She swayed, and he instantly gripped both her shoulders, preventing her from tumbling off the bed. The healer leaned down so they were nearly nose to nose. The blue-green eyes were framed with long lashes.
"Do you want to lie back down?"
"I'll be fine," Jenna gasped. Just give me a minute."
"Then here, head between your knees."
Gently he pushed her head down toward the floor.
"Breathe."
One hand remained between her shoulder blades. She was acutely conscious of the weight of it, the warmth of it, and the pressure of his knees braced against hers. Eventually, her head cleared enough that she could nod for him to go on. Just let me know if you need a break. Once I get this uncovered, you can lie back if you want to. Khan! The healer barked, making her jump. She hadn't realized he'd been speaking so softly. Jenna's going to need something clean to change into. Such as... Bring a loose-fitting man's shirt, the healer said. Small clothes and new bed linens. It amused Jenna to think of Karn hunting for small clothes. The lieutenant went to the door, conversed with the blackbirds outside, and returned to his seat. You're still shivering, Adam said. That's why dungeons are not a good place to treat patients, he said loudly again for Karn's benefit. Here, wrap up in this. He draped the scratchy blanket around her shoulders, and she snuggled into it gratefully. Now, he said, let's have a look. Gently, he eased her bedclothes down across her hips and spread a clean sheet over top. Then quickly, he unwound the bandage that held the dressing in place, pitching it onto the floor. The dressing was stuck to the wound, but he pulled it free so quickly that Jenna had no time to tense up. Maybe it would have been fine anyway. The area around the wound was totally numb, cold and lifeless. Next came the wound packing, nasty and foul-smelling, followed by a gout of drainage that the healer sopped up with more rags. That, she felt, that hurt like a stubbed toe. She tried not to show it, but the tears came anyway. He took both her hands now and released his witchery into her. Just as when Karn had tried to interrogate her at the Lady of Grace, it did nothing. Adam noticed. He leaned close, again speaking softly so that Karn couldn't hear. Are you blocking me, Jenna? If so, please don't. I promise I'm only trying to help you with the pain.
I'm not a mage. I'm not doing anything. It just doesn't work on me.
It doesn't really feel like you're blocking me, he said slowly, his eyebrows drawn together in a frown. More like I'm pouring water through a sieve. He rummaged in his carry bag, found a cloth sack, and shook a fuzzy gray-green leaf onto his palm. Hold this under your tongue, he said. See if it helps. The leaf was faintly bitter to the taste, but the healer was right. It did help. She felt her body relaxing, floating. The pain was still there, but it was like it belonged to somebody else. That way, it was at least tolerable. Meanwhile, he gathered up the sheet full of nasty rags and set them aside. That was the worst part, he said. You can lie back now. He washed his hands and dried them on a clean rag, helped her settle into place in bed, and covered her top half with the blanket. He dipped a cloth into the water, wrung it out, and worked some soap into it, then rolled her bedclothes back so he could get at the wound again. His touch was gentle, his movements sure. Though he wasn't any older than she was, Jenna could tell that he'd done this many times before. The way he went about it made an awkward situation bearable. He washed the wound out with water several times, then gently probed it with his fingers. It was strangely unsettling to feel the pressure of his fingers under numb skin. He slid a hand under his tunic to grip his jinx piece and muttered charms. Nothing seemed to happen. Finally, shaking his head, he sat back. He used his forearm to swipe sweat from his face, since his hands were once again covered in blood. Here's the news, he said. Healing magic doesn't seem to work on you, meaning I can't repair the damage through wizardry. Unfortunately, you are not resistant to the magic in the blade. It will kill you if left alone. I'm guessing it won't be pleasant.
Jenna leaned closer. You could give me a gentle death.
I could, he said. But if I treat you, and then you die, then I'll be in for an ungentle death. I would need more information in order to decide whether to make that trade. What are you two whispering about? Karn demanded. She's telling me about working in the coal mines, the healer called back. How it's not for everybody,
But if you survive, you get to keep on doing it.
He's a smart-ass, Jenna thought. I like that in a person. Karn stood, picked up his stool, and carried it over to the head of Jenna's bed, then sat again, close enough to listen in. Adam washed his hands again. Jenna had never seen anyone so keen on hand-washing.
"All right, Jenna," he said with a grim smile. "I've got one more thing to try. Let's both hope this works."
Taking a deep breath, as if bracing for an ordeal, he placed his palm over the wound. She felt the tingle of magic against her skin, then a pulling sensation, as if he were drawing something out of the wound. It felt peculiar, like he was trying to yank her spine out through her navel.
"What are you doing?"
she said, pressing herself down into the bed.
"I may not be able to heal what is already damaged, but I can draw the magic out and give you a fighting chance."
She fixed on his face. Adam's eyes were squinted with concentration, and sweat beaded his upper lip as if he were calling on all the strength he had. It went on, until she felt as if she might turn inside out. This time, it made a difference. Gradually, the area around the wound warmed as the blood returned. It grew more and more painful as sensation returned as well. She gasped, and his eyes met hers.
"I'm sorry. Sometimes the cure seems worse than the disease."
As her strength returned, hope rekindled, and her will to live burned brighter. But the healer, he looked worse and worse as she grew better. His skin went ashy. His breathing became labored, his eyes clouded. At one point, he turned away and vomited something vile into the basin, but right away he went back to it, pulling and pulling and pulling until he looked more like the patient than the healer.
"Stop it," she said. "Healer, that's enough. You're hurting yourself."
She gripped his wrists with newfound strength and tried to pull his hands away from the wound. He shook his head fiercely and pressed harder. The silent struggle continued until the healer swayed, slumped sideways, and crumbled onto the floor.
"Karn!"
she cried out. Vaulting from the bed, she knelt beside the healer, but Karn was already there. Swearing, the lieutenant rolled the boy onto his back.
"What happened? Did you stab him too?"
"Shut it,"
Jenna said.
"I think he's fainted."
She brushed the healer's hair off his clammy forehead. His eyes were closed, his lids like twin bruises against the pallor of his face, his legs and arms twitching uncontrollably. Squatting in front of him, Karn slapped him on the cheeks, at first lightly and then with more force. There was no response. Jenna gripped Adam's hands, chafing them, wishing she could somehow pull the deadly magic back, but she had no idea how. Reaching into the neckline of his tunic, she pulled out the jinx piece. It was the serpent pendant she'd seen in the healer's memory. She tried to wrap both of his hands around the pendant, but they fell away as soon as she let go. No, nobody else was going to die because of her. She glared at Karn.
"You're a mage. Heal him."
He shook his head, shrugging helplessly.
"I don't know how."
In desperation, she grabbed the water pitcher from a niche in the wall and upended it over the healer's head. Adam spluttered and coughed, batting at the pitcher with one hand.
"I'm all right," he said. "Stop drowning me."
He shook his head, spraying water everywhere like a dog. Jenna grabbed up a clean rag and mopped at his face. Now his hand found his amulet, and he hung on.
"I've just got to learn to pace myself, is all," he said, licking his lips.
"You've got to learn not to do stupid things,"
Jenna said. Karn sat back on his heels and looked at Jenna for the first time.
"Well, well."
He smiled faintly, a smile of relief.
"You look better if he doesn't. You are a fine healer, Freeman. The legend lives on."
Jenna sank back onto the bed, her fingers searching out the wound under her rib cage. Though it was still open, it no longer drew her attention like an icy boil, and the skin around the wound was hardening. Her head was clearer than it had been for days, and she was beginning to care that she was filthy. That's amazing," she said. She looked at the drenched healer. "You're amazing." Then Adam smiled, a full-on, genuine smile that warmed her to the core. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe they looked like a pair of loons, grinning at each other in a dungeon cell. Maybe it would be all ashes and regret tomorrow. But she couldn't help smiling back. 27. To the King's Health. By the next morning, Ash had nearly recovered, physically at least, from his healing of Jenna. He had a depleted amulet and a major magical hangover, which wasn't improved by the tongue lashing he received from Master Merrill for leaving his post the day before.
"What do you mean disappearing yesterday and leaving all of your work for Harold and Boyd to do?" Merrill demanded. "They couldn't do some of the calculations, so the proportions were wrong, and we had to throw out the entire batch. Do you have any idea what that costs?"
Ash stared at him in dull disbelief.
"Didn't they tell you where You are answerable to me," Merrill fumed. "I don't care what else you had to do. You need my permission to leave your work area."
Ash wasn't long on patience to begin with, and what little he had was quickly draining away.
"The king summoned me. I didn't think it was wise to say no."
That made things worse, especially when the master healer noticed the condition of Ash's tunic, which was draped over a chair.
"Is that blood on your tunic? Were you performing surgery? By the great saint, you are not qualified. If His Majesty doesn't understand that now, I'll make sure he does before the day is out."
"You do that," Ash said.
"You go right ahead and talk to him. Make your case. Let me know how that works out for you."
And he pushed past the master healer and into the compounding area. All morning and into the afternoon, Ash couldn't keep his mind off Jenna Bandelow, with the golden eyes and kindled skin. It was as if their minds had been joined, however briefly, when he tried to examine her. It would be a long time before he recovered from that. He picked over the images Jenna had shared with him, hurtling down into a coal hole in a huge iron bucket, a bridge exploding too far away to hear, the pieces sparkling in the sunlight before landing in the river. The King of Arden on a platform, looking down on a sea of roughly dressed miners, a little girl struggling in his grip until he broke her and flung her aside. A name scrawled on the side of a building, Flamecaster. A battered building with a sign over the door, Fletcher's Tack and Harness. A warehouse in flames, sending sparks high into the winter sky. Ash had played at murder in the summers, returning to the sanctuary of Odin's Ford the rest of the year. If what he'd seen was true, Jenna had been a fighter and a survivor nearly every day of her life. She put him to shame. If he could believe what he'd seen, perhaps her gift was the planting of lies that mimic the truth. Truth or not, he did believe it. When he'd asked her what it meant, she'd said, "It means that we are done lying to each other." But he'd never agreed to that. He had a lot to lose by telling the truth. Maybe she knew the truth already. She'd spotted him for a wolf, after all, as soon as she saw him. After all these years away, did that mean he was still a wolf under the skin? She'd mucked around in his mind. What else had she learned about him that she might reveal under interrogation? Would he end up regretting that he'd saved her life? No, he didn't regret it. He couldn't. That had been his mission since his father's murder, to heal the innocent and punish the guilty. It was as if they'd shared a lifetime during that brief connection. The only other person who knew him that well was his sister Liz, and he'd changed so much that she didn't really know him anymore. Had Liz changed as much as he had? One thing he knew, Jenna Bandelow was dangerous. He'd saved her life, Now he should just stay away from her. But he couldn't. Every time he thought of her, his heart accelerated and his gut clenched with longing. He'd been alone for so long. Though he'd walked out with girls at school, he'd kept his mind and emotions under lock and key. Had he really been so hungry for a different kind of connection that he'd completely lost his footing? It wasn't like she'd shown any sign of being smitten with him. If he made a move on a patient, chained in a dungeon, it would just seem creepy. Don't lose your head, Sulan. Remember what you're here for. As his father always said, the hunter who can't keep his eyes on his target goes to bed hungry. Remember that feeling you had when you thought Lys was the one locked in Montaigne's dungeon. The best way to help Jenna Bandolo was to kill the King of Arden, sooner rather than later. All morning and into the afternoon, Meryl's foul mood continued. Harold and Boyd disappeared after the setup, so Ash cleaned up the lab afterward. Then he was assigned to change all the beds in the infirmary, although no one had slept in them. By the time he'd finished, the place had emptied out. Even Meryl had given up finding him jobs to do and disappeared.
You survived, I see.
Ash looked up to see Lila standing in the doorway of the infirmary.
Barely, he said.
You do look like scummer on a slab.
She came forward into the room, peering around to make sure nobody else was in there. Then she perched on the edge of one of the prep tables.
So who was it who so desperately needed your skilled healing hand?
Ash shared an edited version of what had happened the night before, still wary of handing Lila anything that might be used against him. Lila listened, head cocked, swinging her legs.
Her name is Jenna Bandolo?
So I'm told,
Ash said.
She's from Delphi?
Ash nodded.
Why is she important? Is she a blue blood or...
She's a coal miner.
A coal miner?
Lila sat forward, her hands on her knees.
Seriously? So what does the king want with a coal miner?
She says they suspect she's a saboteur back home, and they're going to try and make her give up her friends.
Is she a saboteur?
Maybe, Ash said. Probably.
Well, how's it looking? Do you think she'll survive?
I think she has a good chance now, Ash said.
Lila chewed her lip like she wanted to say something, but couldn't quite get it out.
What?
Lila raised both hands.
Never mind.
She slid down from the table.
I actually came here to fetch you to the Great Hall.
Ash eyed her suspiciously.
Why?
Did you know that it's solstice?
Solstice? Really?
Ash stared at Lila, ambushed by a flood of memories. Celebrations of solstice and Fellsmarch, wizard lights decorating the evergreens on the palace grounds, taking the sleigh up into the mountains to cut pine roping and fir, wassailing the trees in the palace gardens, breaking open the solstice crackers at dinner, releasing magical illuminated birds that fluttered around the room. His father's dramas in the great hall that rivaled those seen in any large city. And later, solstice at Odin's Ford, when the temple choirs sang on the quad, and speakers from all the temples proclaimed the good news of the returning sun. Lila grinned.
I thought you might have overlooked it. I came to get you. They're serving wassail in the Great Hall, and we are invited to drink to the king's health.
To his good health or bad health?
Thanks for coming to get me. I need to get something from my room. I'll be right back.
In his room, Ash stood on his bed to retrieve a thin leather sleeve that he'd slid behind the crown molding. Inside, he'd hidden a needle painted with black adder. Anyone pricked with it would be unlikely to know he'd been stung until much later, when it was too late. Ash slid it into the pouch under his collar, alongside the bottle he'd hidden there the day before. Slinging his healer's bag over his shoulder, he rejoined Lila.
Let's go,
he said. She eyed the bag.
Do you ever stop working?
I'm going down to see my patient afterward, he said.
The great hall was crowded with servants and soldiers and the petty nobility, many of them already deep in their cups. There were huge wassail bowls at either end of the room, and fruits and nuts and cakes and pastries. Many of the servants were decked out in unusual finery, having left off the uniforms of Arden for a day. Apparently, this wassailing custom was a long-standing tradition. Ash found it interesting how different people looked when they wore the clothes they chose themselves. Almost unrecognizable. He was still wearing drab healer colors, since he didn't really have any other clothes. The wassail was thick and potent. Someone had tacked up sprigs of mistletoe in every doorway, and many were taking advantage of it. At the center of the hall, a small dais had been constructed, layered over with evergreens and white and gold ribbon. Up on the platform stood a table, centered with 2 large gold chalices. That must be where the royal family would preside over the festivities and drink to the return of the sun. Ash worked his way in that direction, hoping to get access to the stage before the king arrived. But when he went to mount the steps, a brace of blackbirds blocked his way.
That up there is for the king and his family, one said. There's plenty for you lot at the ends of the hall.
Ash loitered next to the dais, nursing his drink, waiting for another opportunity. Finally, a stir at the far end of the room announced the arrival of the king and queen and their entourage, clad in their holiday finery, a riotous bouquet of color. The procession was surrounded by perhaps 4 dozen blackbirds, armored and grim, no doubt the result of the recent attempt on the king's life. Whoever this competing would-be assassin is, he's making my job a lot harder, Ash thought. The contrast between glittering armor and glittering jewels and silk and gold and taffeta was striking. Under the pikes of the guardsmen, the crowd parted like water before the prow of a great ship, closing behind the royal procession like a wake. Montaigne was clad in cloth of gold. Queen Marina was dressed all in white, her gown a stunning contrast to her dark hair and complexion. Her trailing sleeves were edged in white ermine, uncommon here in the south. Ash studied her with interest. He rarely saw the queen, who almost never left her apartments. She seemed ill at ease and kept her eyes on her feet, moving cautiously, as if afraid of a misstep. With them was a handsome, dark-haired boy, near Ash's age, perhaps a little older, wearing a circlet of gold, and a younger girl, maybe a 7-year, whose hair had been arranged in soft ringlets.
That's Prince Jarrett, heir to the throne, and Princess Madeleine,
Lila murmured. She'd found him in the crowd. Both royal children had inherited something of their mother's beauty, though their complexions favored their father's. The boy had a stingy-looking mouth and his father's glacial blue eyes. Ash planted himself by the steps where the royals would pass by, carefully palming his needle. But an impenetrable wall of black uniforms kept him from getting to within arm's length of any of them. When the royal family reached center stage, a servant filled jeweled cups from the 2 gold chalices, one for the adults and another, perhaps less potent brew for the children. Marin Karn stood to the right of the dais, and a foot or 2 below, covered in the military glitter bits appropriate to his rank. Ash looked around the room, finally spotting Destin Karn in the galleries, scanning the crowd for trouble. For once he was wearing the black of the Royal Guard, a dress sword belted at his waist. When everyone on the stage was served, Montaigne and his queen lifted their cups. As was traditional, they would drink first.
To the great good health of the servants of this household, and the noble houses that are our strength. To the health of the nation, and glory to the great saint.
And the assemblage lifted their much less elaborate cups and cried,
To the great good health of their majesties, King Gerard Montaigne and Queen Marina, and their royal highnesses, Prince Jarrett and Princess Madeleine.
That was when a servant standing next to the chalice swayed and crumpled to the floor. There was instant pandemonium up on the stage. Marin Karn batted the cup from the king's hand. It landed, rolling, splattering steaming wassail everywhere until it disappeared over the edge. The royal children set their cups down with a thunk, their faces pale and frightened. The blackbirds surrounding the stage formed a prickling wall around the dais and blocked all the exits to the hall. But Queen Marina tilted her head back and drank greedily, 3 huge gulps, before Father Faustnot wrenched the cup from her hands and handed it off to a blackbird. Then he gripped her wrist and thrust his face into hers, haranguing her about something.
"Who was that? The one that fell?" Ash whispered.
"That was the King of Arden's taster," Lila said. She pulled him into a corner and got in his face. "Do you know anything about this?"
"What do you mean?"
"No doubt they'll search all of us. You're not carrying anything you shouldn't be, are you? If so, give it to me, and I'll get rid of it."
"Besides an amulet?"
Ash touched his amulet, in the process returning his sting to its sheath.
"Do you think I'm stupid? Only a fool would use a fast-acting poison on a target with a taster. The taster goes down before the king gets it into his system."
Lila blinked at him, as if surprised by this display of logic. "What about the viper?" she persisted. "Were you responsible for that?"
"I may be good with animals, but until I can teach a snake to bite the right person, I wouldn't use one to try and kill someone. Either this would-be killer is an amateur, or someone wants to put the king on his guard."
Ash watched as Merrill forced his way through the crowd to kneel at the taster's side. And that's when the queen collapsed. Her ladies surrounded her, fluttering like birds. Merrill abandoned the taster and knelt by the queen's side.
"Blood and bones,"
Ash muttered, debating. He hated to leave the queen in Merrill's incapable hands. There was no escaping the hall anyway. "You can't save everyone, Sulhan." That was becoming his mantra. And suddenly, somehow, Destin Karn was there, in Ash's face.
"Come with me,"
he said, gripping Ash's arm,
"and see to the queen."
The lieutenant seemed unaccountably agitated. Maybe he was worried that if the queen died, he would get the blame for not somehow preventing it.
"Master Merrill's handling it," Ash said. "I'd rather not butt in. He's furious with me already, and I'm still a little shaky from—" "Listen to me, Healer," Karn said. "The queen is the kindest, most compassionate, the only truly decent person in this entire court. You are going to come with me, and you are going to heal her if you can, understand?"
"All right," Ash said. "Let's go."
"That's what you get for being so damned capable,"
Lila called after him. 28. Death's Doorstep. The crowd parted to let Ash and Karn through. He climbed onto the dais to find Merrill waving a pomander under the queen's nose.
"Stay back and give Her Majesty some air,"
he cried. Montaigne leaned against a marble pillar, guards on every side, arms folded across his chest. His eyes were like chipped ice, fixed on Destin Karn. There would be no getting close to the king now.
"That poison was meant for me, Lieutenant. How could you let this happen when there has already been one attempt on my life? You knew there was an assassin in the palace."
He gestured angrily, the stone on his right hand glittering.
"Apparently, he has the run of the place." "Nobody leaves this room without being searched and questioned," Karn said. "The kitchen staff are being interrogated as we speak. We will find out who's responsible."
Ash knelt beside the queen. She lay on her back like a princess in a story, her skin pale as porcelain, her breathing shallow and ineffective. There was a blue tinge around her lips and fingernails.
"Go tend to the taster, boy," Merrill snarled. "I'll handle this. I've been treating the royal family for years."
"Then they are lucky they are still alive," Ash murmured.
"I should let you treat the queen, and when she dies, you'll reap the consequences. But I've taken oaths. I can't do that. Now get out of my way." "Merrill,"
Lieutenant Karn said, planting a hand on the master's shoulder.
Do as he says, by the king's command."
The look Merrill gave him was pure poison itself. The healer rose, straightened his tunic with great dignity, and crossed the dais to where the taster lay, neglected. Ash sent up a prayer for the taster, then turned back to Queen Marina. Using his thumb and forefinger, he slid back her eyelids, and did not like what he saw. He looked up at Karn.
"Bring me the cup she drank from."
Karn did as he was told. When he handed Ash the wassail cup, Ash sniffed at it, sniffed again. There, amid the cinnamon and clove and rum, he smelled something familiar. Geddon. Made from a fungus that grows on yew trees, it was easy to find throughout the 7 realms. There was no time to lose. He rummaged in his kit, came up with a small brown bottle, thrust it into Karn's hands.
1 pot powder, 1 pot water. Cook over flame until it dissolves."
Karn glanced over to where Merrill was hunched over the taster, but watching them.
"Perhaps Master Merrill—" "No," Ash said, recalling the water hemlock incident. "Whatever you do, don't get him involved. Do it now!" he roared when Karn hesitated. "Are you going to wait until she is dead?"
Ash turned back to the Queen. Her breathing was already slowing. Soon she would forget to breathe, her heart forget to beat. The poison was abroad in her body, hunting down the spark of life so it could be extinguished. There was no easy way to call it back. The best he could do until Karn returned was to support her breathing and keep her heart going. He leaned close, feeling the whisper of her breath against his cheek, the thread of her pulse in her wrist. When her heartbeat faltered, he pressed both hands against her chest and used flash to compress and release the heart. It seemed to take forever, but finally Karn was back, with a bottle of warm, murky liquid. Ash sniffed at it, nodded, and said, "Good. Now sit her up as best you can." He felt Lila's presence behind him. "Each of you, take an arm and hold her steady." Tipping her chin up, Ash poured half of the preparation into her mouth. "If you can hear me, Your Majesty, please swallow." He wasn't sure if she heard him or not. He massaged her throat. She coughed and choked a little, but he managed to get most of it down. They waited. For an awful moment, she lay still and cold. Then she took a deep breath, released it, took another. The color returned to her pallid cheeks. Her breathing strengthened, and her heartbeat too. Karn and Lila both breathed out, as if they had been holding their breaths. "Good work, healer," Karn said softly, not bothering to hide the relief in his voice. Ash held up the bottle with the remaining antidote. "Give this to the taster," he said. Lila cleared her throat.
"He's dead,"
she said.
"You may as well give her the rest of it."
Ash turned back to the Queen. "Your Majesty," he murmured, stroking the damp hair off her forehead. "Can you take a little more?" She opened her dark eyes and smiled at him, as if she would know him anywhere, as if they were old friends under the skin.
"I had the most wonderful dream," she whispered. "I dreamed that I had died."
29. Visiting Hours. It's one thing to be locked in a dungeon when you're nearly dead, and it doesn't matter much where you are. But Jenna was feeling better and getting restless. Though she'd worked underground for half her life, she was a person who needed to see the sky, even briefly, every day. She wanted to feel the wind in her face and breathe in all the scents it carried. Not that there weren't smells in the King of Arden's dungeon. She just didn't like any of them. She needed a bath. She didn't even want to be with herself. Jenna was still manacled to the wall, but Karn had given her a longer chain, maybe convinced that she didn't intend to hang herself. So she used the extra bit to pace back and forth, burning off energy and trying to build her strength back up. If she had the chance to escape, she wanted to be ready. She'd slid her pendant out of the lining of her velvet coat and had hidden it between 2 loose stones in the wall. She was tempted to put it back on, but worried that it would be discovered. She was hungry, too, starving, in fact, like her body knew that it had fasted for a week and was making up for lost time. She had no way to mark the time, but it seemed forever since anyone had brought her food. That wasn't the only thing she was hungry for. She'd hoped the healer, Adam Freeman, would have come back to see her by now. She was drawn to him in a way she hadn't been since Riley, back when she was just a littling and easily smitten. It's not easy to muster up a romance when you're cold and exhausted and dirty most of the time. It didn't help the cause that she'd been walking the world as a boy ever since Riley died. Besides, after Riley, she'd realized that love was just a setup to get your heart broken. So now she was locked in a dungeon, dirty as a miner on a bender, and she was falling for the enemy's healer, who might be a wolf. Maybe she hadn't learned much after all. Wolf, she repeated in her head, like a besotted farm girl. She really should stop calling him healer and wolf, but Adam Freeman didn't sound right somehow, and so she had a hard time saying it. Even when he said it, it sounded like a lie. She was getting tired of the tight circle she could make around the bed. She scanned the room. The torches were mounted high on the wall. If she stood on the bed, she might be able to reach them. Then what, play with them? They wouldn't burn hot enough to melt her shackles. Still, for something to do, she climbed up on the bed and stretched up high, reaching, feeling the pull in the wound in her belly. She heard somebody fumbling at the door and dropped like a rock, hitting the bed hard. Was it the healer? Her heart accelerated. But no. The door swung open to reveal Destin Karn with a goblet in one hand and her jeweled dagger in the other. Oh.
What was that noise?
His eyes flicked around the room.
What noise?
Just now.
Jenna gave him a look like you might give a littling who's making up stories.
I didn't hear it.
Karn crossed to the bed and pulled up a stool, resting the blade across his knees. At least the blade was clean now. He raised the goblet.
Happy solstice, Jenna,
he said. He took a long drink.
Is it really solstice? I didn't know.
Karn raised his glass again.
May the sun come again.
Where is my wassail?
She asked, eyeing his.
You need to be careful drinking wassail around here,
Karn said with a wink. His slow, deliberate speech said that he'd definitely been drinking, though he wasn't stumble-drunk.
I'll chance it.
When he didn't respond, she said,
What about something to eat?
Karn furrowed his brow.
Are you hungry?
Nobody's been down here all day, Jenna said. So yes, I'm hungry.
Oh, he said. I'm sorry.
He seemed to think that handled it. Jenna gritted her teeth.
Why are you here? I need to ask you some questions, he said, now that you're feeling better.
Jenna's empty stomach clenched. This was what she'd worried about all along, that if she survived, she'd be put to the question. He'd brought nothing with him save a cup of wassail and the dagger, but there was a whole array of torture tools just outside her door.
Look, she said, I'm not who you think I am.
Who do you think I think you are?
Karn said. It took a while to hack through that word tangle.
You think I'm one of those patriots, but I'm not. I worked in the mines and made a little coin on the side telling fortunes. Me and my da, we just tried to keep our heads down and stay out of trouble. Yet you came into my father's tavern and you killed him.
It was an accident,
Karn said.
Well, he's just as dead as if you did it on purpose, isn't he?
Jenna was having a hard time reining in her temper, partly because she was guilty and her father was innocent. Yet he was the one who had died. Karn waved this away.
Anyway, I'm not here about the Patriots.
You're not? He shook his head.
I'm here about you."
Fear lay like a stone in her belly.
"Look, if you think you can get drunk, come down here and—"
He shook his head. "No," he said flatly.
"Tell me what you know about the symbol embedded in your neck."
And that was how the truth she'd been beating away with both hands found a place to roost.
"This is really about the mage mark?"
"Yes," Karn said. "It is."
"Then you probably know more than I do,"
she said, exploring it with her fingers.
"You've seen it, I haven't."
"Were you born with it?"
"As far as I know, it's like a birthmark. Or maybe a curse."
"A curse?"
Karn leaned forward, eyes narrowed.
"What do you mean?"
Jenna didn't know much, so she saw no reason not to spill it.
"All I know is what I've been told," she said. "My parents adopted me from an old woman who said she was my grandmother. She said they should hide the birthmark because people would kill me because of it."
"What people? And why?"
"She didn't say."
Karn scowled, like he was angry with her dead grandmother for not leaving clear directions.
"Have you seen it anywhere else? The symbol, I mean. Or seen anyone else with a marking in the same place?"
"No," Jenna said, "but I haven't really been looking."
"What was your grandmother's name?"
"I don't know."
"Where was she from?"
"She never said, I guess, though my doll said she sounded like a foreigner."
Karn rolled his eyes.
"Your parents adopted a baby, and they didn't ask a single swiving question?" "They must have asked when my name day was, so they could celebrate it when it came around," Jenna said. When he kept shaking his head, she said, "Look, they waited a long time to have a baby. They were getting up in years. Maybe they figured beggars can't be choosers. Or they might learn something they didn't want to know."
"Have you ever been to the Northern Islands, or Carthus?"
Jenna shook her head.
"I'm not even sure where that is."
"Perhaps your family was from there, or maybe they traveled there."
"Why all these questions about places I've never been? Are you sure you have the right person?"
"Why is the Empress Celestine looking for you?"
Karn snapped the question out like it would catch her off guard. Jenna felt like she was wading in deeper and deeper with nothing to hang on to.
"Who is Empress Celestine?"
"Empress Celestine is the Empress in the East. She rules the Northern Islands and Carthus," Karn said. "Or most of Carthus. So, what is her interest in you? And don't tell me you don't know, because I don't believe you."
"I don't know what to say, then. I never heard of her, and I had no idea she was interested in me. If she's the one looking, then why don't you ask her?"
"That," he said, wincing, "would not be a good idea." He held up the dagger. "Where did you get this?"
"My grandmother gave it to my parents. She said it belonged to my mother."
"What's your mother's name? Where is she now?"
"I don't know her name, and she's dead. Both my parents are dead."
"Really?" Karn said skeptically. "Let me fill you in. This weapon of yours is from the Northern Islands. It is carried by Empress Celestine's blood-sworn warriors."
Jenna stared at it, then looked up at Karn.
"But you acted like you didn't know anything about it before, when Freeman was trying to treat me."
"What I've been told is that nobody survives a cut from a blood-sworn blade. Sharing that would have served no good purpose."
Jenna swallowed hard.
"Oh."
That explained why Karn was so desperate to get her to Arden's court, because he thought she was going to die.
"So, it seems that Freeman is very good at what he does. Now," he said as if he'd backed her into a blind alley, "would you like to change your story?"
"Not unless you want me to make something up."
It was like she was in class at the temple, and she hadn't done her work.
"Celestine tends to seek out the powerful. So what makes you powerful, Jenna? What does she want from you?"
Karn's rapid-fire questions about things she knew nothing about were getting on her nerves.
Think about it, Lieutenant, she said. If I were powerful, do you think I'd be locked up in somebody's dungeon?
You are resistant to Majory, he said.
I didn't know that until you tried to spell me.
Do you have other gifts as well?
Nothing that an Empress would cross the ocean for.
Such as? Jenna sighed.
I see things that other people can't. Like, visions. Sometimes I see hints of the future. Sometimes I see a person as they really are. Or I see the truth when you tell me a lie.
Karn shifted on his stool, as if he found that last bit unsettling. What else? He persisted, even if it seems trivial.
I have good hearing and a sensitive nose. I can see farther than anyone I know, even in the dark. She hesitated. I heal up quick, whether it's a cut or whatever. And I don't burn.
What?
Just what I said. My skin turns heat and flame. Even when I was little, I could snuff out a lantern with my fingers or pull a pan out of the oven bare-handed.
Karn didn't seem impressed. How is that helpful?
It's helpful to a blaster, Jenna said. Or a baker.
Karn gripped the chain that bound Jenna's wrists and jerked her in close so they were eye to eye. Do you think this is some kind of joke? I don't think you understand just how precarious your situation is, he hissed. The Empress is hunting you, and we need to know why before she finds you. As it sometimes did, the truth tapped Jenna on the shoulder.
Who's we? She said. The king doesn't even know you're down here, does he?
Karn stared at her for a long moment, his face gone stony as the Felsian escarpment. He pushed to his feet, reached high, and pulled down one of the torches. You're resistant to flame, are you? He thrust the torch into her face, and she flinched back, startled. Prove it. Jenna raised her manacled hands to shield her face. I don't know what you're trying to... I said prove it! He jabbed at her again, and this time she closed both hands around the flaming head of the torch and held on until she smothered it out. By then, the end of her sleeve had caught fire, and she had to bat it out against her side.
Look what you did,
she said, examining the charred cuff.
I only have the one shirt, and you...
Blood of the martyrs, Karn whispered. I never meant you to... Let me see your hands. Karn gripped both her wrists and examined the palms of her hands. He sucked in a breath and looked up at her, eyes wide with relief or surprise, or both. They're not blistered. They're not even red. He tapped her hand with his fingertip. It feels like they're armored.
That comes and goes, Jenna said, pulling free. I don't know why you keep asking me questions when you don't believe any of my answers.
At that moment, the door banged open and they both turned, startled. It was the healer, Adam Wolf, his arms full of packages. He froze in the doorway, staring at the two of them, apparently clasping hands. What the hell is going on? He spoke quietly, but his voice was laced with steel, and there was a darkness at his center that she'd not seen before. Freeman, Karn said, this is a surprise. Obviously, Adam said. He set his packages down at the head of Jenna's bed and turned to face Karn, his body balanced and ready for action. He did resemble a wolf in a way, one who had chosen his prey and was considering the kill. Well, what are you doing here? He took a step toward Karn. I told you that she needed rest. You couldn't let this wait for even a day? Careful, healer, Karn said with icy calm, though one hand found his amulet. Don't lose your head and do something you'll regret. I needed to question Jenna today, because it was now or never. She may be your patient, but she is our prisoner.
But I'll get the blame if she has a relapse. Adam sniffed the air, then took another good look around the room. What's burning? One of the torches went out, Karn said, shooting Jenna a warning look as he relit the torch and set it back into place. Ah, Jenna thought. The lieutenant doesn't want the healer, or the king, to know what he's been up to. Well then. Her Da always said that when somebody offers an unexpected gift, it was bad manners not to take it.
Don't be too hard on the Lieutenant, Wolf, Jenna said. He came to tell me that he's arranged for a bath, some books, and a transfer out of the dungeon into an actual room.
Jenna couldn't say who looked more surprised, Karn or Adam.
Really? Adam said, looking at Karn, narrow-eyed. That's difficult to believe.
By then, Karn had his sharp's face back on. He smiled crookedly, acknowledging the deal.
The bath and the books are no problem, but the transfer may not happen until after I get back.
Karn scooped up the dagger and got off a bit of a bow.
Jenna, we'll speak again.
With that, he went out the door. 30. Solstice Celebration. As soon as Karn walked out, Adam pulled the door shut and swung back around.
Are you all right, Jenna?
He said, his eyes glittering in the torchlight. I'm all right.
He didn't hurt you? When I walked in, I could have sworn that Lieutenant Karn was threatening you.
Jenna decided not to share the part with the torch. She saw no good coming from it. No, she said. Not really. Karn seemed eager for answers, but he didn't get rough, if that's what you mean. Maybe he's been told not to hurt me.
It's hard to imagine King Gerard coming up with a rule like that, Adam said, claiming the stool.
Jenna hesitated. I got the feeling that Karn was down here on his own account, like the king didn't know he was interrogating me, and... She trailed off, distracted by a delicious smell. Is that food in there? She said, eyeing the healer's packages.
Adam nodded. I brought you some from the solstice celebration. Do you feel up to eating?
Jenna snatched up one of the parcels and sniffed at it. Roast beef, sharp cheddar cheese, freshly baked bread. She was practically drooling on it. Ripping away the cloth, she took a large bite. The healer stared at her, surprised, then loosed one of his rare smiles.
You seem to be feeling much better, he said. Better than I could have hoped, considering the way you looked yesterday.
Jenna nodded, not wanting to talk with her mouth full. She swallowed, then said, I am much better. I've always been quick to heal, but you work magic.
Maybe, he said, hunching his shoulders like praise made him uncomfortable. I'll want to take a look at that wound in a bit.
He watched her eat for a while, then said, like a dog returning to a bone,
What kinds of questions was he asking? Karn, I mean.
That's what surprised me. He said he wasn't here about the Patriots.
Patriots?
The ones in Delphi fighting King Gerard. I thought that was what it was about, that they thought I was doing spying and setting fire to things. But no, he kept asking me about an empress. She watched the healer carefully to see if he knew about the empress already, but he looked as ambushed as she had been.
What empress?
Someone named Celestine from Carthage, or the Northern Islands. Have you heard of her? He shook his head.
No. All I know about Carthage is, pirates. And that wizards, mages, I mean, came from the Northern Islands. Besides the pirates, the storms are so bad on the Indio these days that we never get ships from there anymore.
Karn said this Celestine was hunting me, and he wanted to know why, and what the mage mark on my neck meant, and all about my family. He seemed tweaked that I couldn't help him. Adam mulled this over.
Does he think you're the Empress's long-lost daughter, or what?
Khan doesn't know what to think. He knows more about the dagger than he let on, though. He says it's the kind carried by the blood-sworn warriors who serve the Empress. He said that nobody survives a cut from those blades.
I knew it was magicked. I just wasn't familiar with the enchantments.
By now, Jenna was licking her fingers, having finished off the meat and cheese.
Do I smell a peach?
She looked pointedly at Adam's bag. Smiling and shaking his head, Adam pulled a ripe peach out of his bag and held it out to her. Jenna snatched it and bit into it, the juice running down her chin.
Merciful Maker, she said. We never get these in Delphi.
Save room, Adam said. I brought sugar cakes and wassail, too.
Wassail?
Jenna leaned forward, making no attempt to hide her excitement.
You brought wassail?
The healer unwrapped another bundle to reveal fancy solstice cakes and set them next to her on the bed. Then he handed her the flask and a cup.
Ah,
Jenna said. She expertly uncorked the flask with her teeth and poured, then wound her fingers about the cup and closed her eyes, breathing deeply.
Everybody makes wassail his own way. Cinnamon, cloves, hard cider.
She took a sip.
Rum, she added.
It's strong, he warned her.
Good,
she said, and drained the cup. Adam stared at her as she picked up a sugar cake and bit off a corner.
I'd go easy on that, he said. Poison and alcohol don't mix.
I disagree, Jenna said. This is just what I need. My da owned a tavern. I used to make the wassail on solstice and on the Day of the Dead. He always said I made it best.
She paused, lost in wistful memory for a moment. When she focused in on Adam again, he seemed to be staring at her lips, which made her stare at his, and wonder what it would be like to...
Stop it.
You've probably got peach juice running down your chin, and that's why he's staring. She mopped her sleeve across it, just in case. Now he probably thinks you were raised in a barn. She refilled her cup, trying to cover her embarrassment. Are you feeling better?
I am,
Adam said, taking a swallow from the flask.
It always takes a while to recover from a healing. Believe it or not, I'm faring better than usual, since I couldn't use magic to heal you.
Jenna frowned, confused. Isn't that what you did?
It's a subtle difference. In most people, I can use magic to close up a wound, or cure an infection, or minimize pain, to treat disorder of whatever kind. In your case, that didn't seem to work. But what I could do was remove the toxic magic that was causing damage, because that wasn't part of you.
He paused, grimacing.
I'm sorry. Sometimes I don't know when I've crossed the line from a conversation into a lecture.
No, it's all very interesting, Jenna said. You do seem like you've had a lot of practice, and some schooling, too, which surprises me. When I first met you, I took you for a soldier.
A soldier? Why a soldier?
Because the King of Arden uses his mages to kill people, not to heal them. Plus you have the body of a soldier. She reached out and squeezed his muscled arm, then quickly let go, flustered. I mean, you didn't get those muscles stitching up wounds or mixing potions.
I don't do much of that around here. I scrub a lot of floors, I'm a demon with a mortar and pestle, and I've been shoveling a lot of horse dung, too.
There's never any shortage of that, Jenna said. The healer laughed.
No, he said, especially not at court.
He tipped back his head and drank again, his long throat jumping as he swallowed.
Now,
he said, setting the flask aside and pulling his healing kit closer.
Before I drink too much, I want to take a look at that wound.
Jenna sat on the edge of the bed, her blanket draped around her hips. She lifted her shirt up out of the way. Adam leaned forward, reaching around her to unwrap the linen. Her skin prickled at his closeness, the warmth of his breath, the scent of soap that she was beginning to associate with him. Looking at the top of his head, she could see a faint line where the natural red of his hair met the brown dye. She resisted the temptation to trace it with her fingers, to let him know she wasn't fooled. I know you, Wolf, she thought, even though you try and keep your secrets. Adam pulled the linen away and set it aside. Jenna's skin pebbled as the air hit her bare middle. Then she felt the warmth of his hands under her ribcage as he examined the wound. Her heart began to thump so hard it seemed he would notice. She fought a sudden urge to slide off the bed and onto his lap, wrap her legs around his middle, and stop it! Still, that idea, once kindled, was hard to put out. Think of something else. Name the saints of the Church of Malthus. That would kill anybody's desire. Fortunately, or unfortunately, the healer's mind was on other things. Blood and bones, he muttered, sitting back. That's impossible. What? Jenna said, breaking out of her fog. She craned her neck, trying to see. Your wound is all but healed. Overnight. He looked up at her, his expression bewildered, as if expecting her to explain. Well, they said you were a damned good healer, Wolf, Jenna said. I'm good, but I'm not that good. Adam shook his head, biting his lower lip. The area over the wound is hard, like armor, or scales. I've not seen anything like it. That always happens when I get hurt, Jenna said. It crusts over like that at first, then goes back to normal. She shrugged. Strange. The healer ran his fingers over the wound. I don't see any reason to wrap it up again. It's better protected than anything I could do. He pulled a jug of water from his kit and warmed it between his hands, then washed the area and allowed it to air dry. When he finished repacking his kit, he set it between his feet, but made no move to leave. He seemed to be wrestling with himself. What? Jenna leaned forward so she could look into his face. Would it be all right if I took a look at your mage mark? Why not? She said with a sigh. Everyone else has. She turned half sideways, scooping her hair up and arching her neck so he could see. He sat next to her on the bed and leaned in close to look, brushing his fingers over the symbol, raising instant gooseflesh. Can you feel that? He asked. She nodded. Maybe I'm just used to it, but it feels like my own skin. I've never seen anything like this, he said. Like metal and jewels set into the skin. Did you have an injury there in the past? It's been there as long as I can remember, Jenna said. I've tried to pry it off, but it's as permanent as any other part of me. Do you know what the symbol means? Everybody keeps asking me, and I don't know. Based on what's happened so far, I'd say it means trouble and bad luck. And you were born with this? So I'm told. The healer was studying her, eyes narrowed, rubbing his chin, as if she was a puzzle that he couldn't work out. What? She said, brushing at herself, thinking maybe she'd dropped something. Why are you telling me all this? He asked bluntly. You don't know me. Why should you trust me? Jenna could tell that he was asking himself the same question, if he should trust her. He's a wary wolf, as well as lonely. I wonder why. She reached out and took one of his hands in both of hers, feeling the buzz of connection between them. You're wrong. I saw you yesterday. I saw the red-haired boy, and the man lying dead in the snow, and the grey wolves. When he said nothing, doubt trickled in. Are you saying that you didn't see me? When he stiffened and shifted his eyes away, she knew that he had. So she pressed him. What did you see? He breathed in, then released the words bottled up inside. Too much, he said. Enough. He paused. Those images I saw. He stopped, cleared his throat. The little girl and the boy and the King of Arden. Were they true? They were true, she said, a catch in her voice. The boy, his name was Riley. He was 15, and I was 12. I'm sorry, Jenna, Adam said softly. I'm sorry that happened. She turned to face him. I punched the king in the nose, she said, fierce tears leaking from her eyes. He bled and bled and bled. She trailed off. That was the beginning. I've been fighting back ever since. Since 12? Do you think I wasn't grown up after that? I see your point. You've had losses too, Jenna said. There was a question buried in there, but he didn't take the bait. Yes, he said. I suppose I'm still walking that line between life and death, trying to choose which side I'm on. I want you on my side, Healer, Jenna said. And I want to be, he said. It's just... He searched her face. How do you ever really know a person? Jenna ran her fingertips over the back of his hand, tracing the veins. Not everything is a lie, Wolf, she said. Sometimes you have to believe what you see. His head came up, as if she'd startled him. Leaning forward, she slid her arms around his neck and kissed him on the lips. For a moment, he resisted, then surrendered. It was a long time before they broke apart. 31. The Empress's Gift. It was becoming an ordeal, getting in to see the king. After only 3 days away at Baston Bay, the change in procedure was striking. Lila and Destin submitted to the pat-down, the interrogation, the majory, all before they even entered the small council chamber. The mage on duty, Mark Desjardins, scowled as he rooted through the crates full of flashcraft. "More chains for the enslaved, Barrow Hill," he said when he'd finished. "You may not approve, but it's a living," Lila said. "Somebody has to do it, so it might as well be me." Desjardins didn't seem impressed by that logic. The blackbirds hoisted the crates and carried them into the hall, Lila and Karn following behind. The usual suspects were ranged around the conference table: Marin Karn, Michel Beaudetort, and Gerard Montaigne. They all wore grim expressions, and the tension was thick as thistle and just as prickly. Whatever they were discussing, it seemed to be bad news, and General Karn was the one in the hot seat. They had no intention of sharing, though, because they quit talking as soon as Lila and Destin walked in. Destin seemed to pick up on the mood in the room as well. His gaze flicked from face to face, resting on his father's the longest. Well, Lila thought, as she and Destin took a knee, at least we've brought some show and tell. Your Majesty, Destin said, Barrow Hill and I are pleased to report that our operation in Baston Bay was a success. In fact, the results have exceeded our wildest dreams. I don't know about that, Lila thought. My dreams are pretty wild. Destin chose an item from each of the crates and set them on the table for display: a collar, a talisman, and an amulet. Lila had never seen General Karn display any spark of excitement or enthusiasm, but now he came damned close before he tamped it down. He picked up an amulet which lit up brightly when he touched it. He set it down again quickly and said, "What's the count?"
133 collars, Destin said, 54 talismans, 114 amulets. It's a pity you weren't able to get more talismans, the general said, mopping at his face with a handkerchief. That's what we really need.
It's a pity you're such a heartless, ungrateful bastard, Lila thought. This time, blessedly, she kept it to herself.
How were you able to secure so many at once? Boditort asked, showing no desire to examine the loot.
We intercepted a shipment of old flash on its way from the southern islands to Chalk Cliffs, Lila said. This is more than 1,000 years old.
What was it doing down south? General Karn asked. They have no use for flashcraft. They drove out their mages a long time ago.
It was hidden down there by the Copperheads at the end of the Wizard Wars, when they knew they'd lost, Lila said. They didn't want it to fall into enemy hands. It's been there, forgotten ever since. Somebody tipped them off, and they decided to ship it back home, so to speak.
How did you find this out?
General Karn persisted, seeming intent on poking holes in her story.
Lila has relatives in the southern islands who keep her informed, Destin said. That's convenient, the general said. Very impressive, Lieutenant Karn, Lila, Montaigne said with a twitch of a smile. Now, more than ever, this could spell the difference between victory and defeat.
General Karn shifted in his seat. What's going on? Lila thought. Did somebody die while I was out of town? There came a pounding at the door. One of the idling blackbirds opened up and spoke briefly with someone outside.
It's the Principia, Your Majesty, the blackbird said. He says it's urgent. Everything these days is urgent, the king said. This had better be. Show him in.
Cedric Fosnot, the spiritual leader of the Church of Malthus, swept into the room in a flurry of self-importance.
Your Majesty, I am so sorry to interrupt, the prelate said. However, a ship has arrived in the harbour from the Northern Islands. The commander came ashore to inform us that he represents the Empress Celestine.
Empress who? Lila thought, but the others wore stunned looks that said they were familiar with the name. What else have I missed? She thought. She was usually better informed than that.
This ship is here, the king said in a low, fierce voice. At the river docks.
Fosnot nodded. He reached inside his robes, pulling out a rolled parchment and a velvet bag.
He gave me a message to you from the Empress, and a token of her esteem.
The prelate extended the parchment and the bag toward the king. Montaigne eyed them warily.
Hold those for the moment, he said. Boditort, tell the staff outside to send for Freeman. Freeman?
Boditort looked from Montaigne to Fosnot, who appeared as unhappy as the Thane.
But what would he— Do it, the king said.
Fosnot opened his mouth as soon as the door closed behind Boditort.
Your Majesty, please indulge this loyal subject's concern in the matter of the healer, he said. Is it really wise to—
His gaze fell on the Karns, and he seemed to be trying to rework what he meant to say.
To introduce unfamiliar magery into the room, especially a mage who has had such a brief tenure here?
The king's lips tightened into a thin line.
The boy has demonstrated more talent in his brief tenure here than many who have been here at court for years.
Lila thought. Maybe I've underestimated the runaway princeling. He seems to have charmed the king, at least. Eventually Ash arrived, with Boditort watchdogging him, having run the gauntlet outside. He bowed to the king. His eyes flicked from Destin to Lila, narrowing when they lit on the crates of flashcraft.
You asked for me, Your Majesty? Fosnot, give the items to the healer so that he can examine them for curses, enchantments, and poisons.
All at once, the Principia seemed more than eager to drop the Empress's gifts into Ash's hands. Ash set the velvet bag on the table. He cradled the parchment in his hands, closed his eyes, and murmured charms over it. He looked up at the king, tapped the seal with his finger, and said, "Would you like to examine the seal, Your Majesty, in order to verify its authenticity before I break it?" Montaigne leaned forward, careful not to get too close, and scanned the seal. "It seems to be in order," he said. Ash broke the seal, unrolled the parchment, and ran his fingertips over the ink, murmuring what sounded like gibberish to Lila. Then nodded as if he'd made a decision. "Good news, Your Majesty," he said. "It is safe. If there were curses present, I have disabled them." He handed the parchment to the king, then turned his attention to the velvet bag. Meanwhile, the king scanned the Empress's message quickly, then thrust it at Destin. "She knows. The bloody Empress knows we found the girl. She wants to make the exchange as soon as possible." "But that doesn't make sense," Destin muttered. "How could she possibly know?" "She's a bloody sorceress," the king snarled. "A witch. Maybe she's sacrificed a virgin or a goat. How would I know?" "She's a witch?" Fosnot looked betrayed. "Commander Strangward never mentioned that." Destin read, tracing the script with a finger. "I understand that you now have the mage-marked girl in your possession. I have sent Commander Strangward with an array of gifts, including a powerful weapon that will ignite terror in the hearts of your adversaries. This will be evidence of my good faith." He looked up. "What's all this about a weapon? Did you see it, Fosnot?" The cleric shook his head. "It's still on board his ship." "She promised us an army of mages," General Karn said, snatching the parchment from his son's hand and reading it over himself. "What makes her think that we would be satisfied with a weapon?" "It takes time and resources to move an army," Destin said. "The Empress might have been unwilling to undertake it without knowing for sure that the girl is the one she is seeking." "What would you know about armies?" General Karn growled. The general never misses an opportunity to take a shot at his son and heir, Lila thought. I wonder why. Destin met his father's sneer unflinchingly. "Given that the Empress learned of the girl's presence here so quickly, I think we have to assume that she has agents right here in the capital." "Agents that you should have ferreted out before now." "Lord Strangward is eager to meet as soon as is conveniently possible," Fosnot said, as if eager to reclaim the stage. "He says that any time after dinner would suit him." "Tonight?" Montaigne snorted. "He shows up here unannounced and demands an immediate audience with the king of the realm." The cleric's mouth twisted as if he tasted something sour. "He appears to be unschooled in court manners, Your Majesty. From his appearance, I would have guessed him to be a horse savage, or a pirate." "He'll just have to wait," the king said. "Tell Strangward we'll meet with him tomorrow in the small hall." Fosnot cleared his throat. "Tomorrow is the feast of St. Malthus." "The day after tomorrow, then," Montaigne amended. "Lord Strangward would prefer that we meet on board his ship, so that he can display the weapon, which is down in the hold." "If he thinks that I am foolish enough to get on board a ship with a pirate, he is sadly mistaken," the king said. "I don't mean to be carried off to the Northern Islands and held for ransom." "Your Majesty," Destin said, "could we perhaps meet in your pavilion at dockside? That would be close to the ship, and yet allow us to meet on our home ground." "I see no reason to meet this barbarian halfway," Montaigne said. "He should be happy that I am meeting with him at all." His liegemen looked at one another, as if each hoped that one of the others would speak up. They want this deal to go forward, Lila thought, whatever it is. Strangward might be unschooled in courtly ways, but the king has no practice at diplomacy either. He's used to getting what he wants by force.
Your Grace, General Karn said, we need that army. We need the funds. And if the Empress is offering a fearsome weapon, we need that too, especially now.
It is your failures that have put us in this position, Karn, Montaigne said. Don't forget that.
It could rekindle enthusiasm for the war in the Thane Council, Bodetort said. We have nothing to lose, and much to gain by hearing what the barbarian has to say. It's a wise leader who keeps his eyes on the ultimate goal, uniting the 7 realms under Ardenine rule, and in the grace of the true church, Fosnot said. We know that you are the kind of strategic thinker who takes the long view, even if it involves dealing with witches. At least until we get what we need from her.
The king looked from one to the other, a muscle working in his jaw.
Spare me the flattery, gentlemen, he said. Very well. We will meet in the small hall. Fosnot, tell Pettyman to arrange for housing for Strangward and his crew outside the— He prefers to stay on board his ship, Your Majesty, Fosnot said. He does not want to inconvenience you or impose on your hospitality. Is that so? The king said. If true, that would be a first. Lieutenant Karn, tell Pettyman to arrange for new quarters for the girl, inside the keep, but on one of the upper floors in the tower. It's already in process, Your Majesty, Destin said.
Montaigne swung toward Ash, who still seemed to be studying the contents of the bag, though Lila suspected he was listening closely.
How's the girl's health?
Ash looked up.
She is doing remarkably well, sire, to have suffered such a serious wound, he said. I would, however, recommend that you wait another week before— See that she's in good shape by the day after tomorrow, the king said. Yes, Your Majesty, Ash said.
Well, Lila thought, at least the princeling seems to be learning when to give way. But he wasn't finished.
Your Majesty, Ash said, would you like to hear more about the Empress's gifts?
The king seemed to have forgotten all about the velvet bag.
Yes, of course, he snapped. What is it?
There are no enchantments, Ash said, weighing the bag in his hand. He pulled a silver platter toward him and emptied the contents onto it.
If I've counted correctly, this bag contains 15 large diamonds. If they are real, they would be of very high value.
Montaigne eyed the diamonds greedily.
You have examined them. They are not poisonous or cursed?
Ash shook his head.
They are not.
Good, the king said, scooping them back into the bag and sliding them into his doublet.
I will examine these further at my leisure. The diamonds are impressive, Your Majesty, but they are not the most precious of the Empress's gifts. This is—
Ash displayed a small ceramic bottle inscribed with runes.
What is it? The king asked. Living silver, Ash said. Very rare, very valuable. Here, let me show you.
Uncorking the bottle, he poured a small amount onto a ceramic plate. It formed small silver globules that rolled around in a mesmerizing way. Ash poked it with his finger, and the droplets shimmered and danced. What the hell is he up to? Lila thought. She craned her neck to get a closer look.
That's remarkable,
the king said, looking smitten.
But what is it good for? Can it be molded or hardened like ordinary silver? Not unless it is married with other metals, Ash said. But that would be a waste. It is most valued for its magical qualities. When burned or heated, it releases white magic.
The king was extending his hand toward it, but now he drew back.
White magic. Bear in mind, I'm no expert, Ash said. All I know is what I've read in the old manuscripts. In the Northern Islands, it is used as a kind of talisman. Its vapors protect against evil.
It is particularly abhorrent to snakes, assassins, and other malevolent creatures. Fosnot made the sign of Malthus. Your Majesty, he said, it is the grace of God that protects us against evil. I can't imagine that the use of such agents would be consistent with— Where was the grace of God when some villain put a viper in my bed? Montaigne said. He turned back to Ash. How was it used? Some sprinkle a few drops on a pomander and carry it with them. Others use a small lamp or diffuser and let it burn all night so that the vapors accumulate during sleep. When used in that way, it has been known to cause some irritation to the eyes and throat, but most sources say that it is relatively minor, and well worth it given the protection it affords. Lila had never heard of liquid silver or white magic, but then she didn't run in magical circles. Have you heard of that? She murmured to Destin. He shook his head, frowning. Why should we trust you, healer? General Karn glared at the silver puddle suspiciously. How do we know that's not some kind of poison or black magic? The General is right, Fosnot said, looking thrilled to have an ally. Here in Arden, we have used sorcery in very careful, tightly controlled ways, to the glory and in the service of the great saint. It is best not to proceed too quickly down this road, lest we go astray. I understand, Father Fosnot. These days one can't be too careful. Ash carefully scooped the living silver back into the bottle, restoppered it, and slid it inside his carry-bag. Is there anything else you wanted me to clear, Your Majesty? Not so fast, Montaigne said, putting up a hand and giving Ash a narrow-eyed look. You want the living silver for yourself. Admit it, Freeman. Ash wet his lips. I only thought that, since you would rather not risk it, that I would— Do you think I'm a fool? Ash hastily dug out the bottle and held it out to the king. Please, take it. I never meant to presume that— If you think it's safe, then why don't you demonstrate for all of us? General Karn said. Blood and bones, Lila thought. Now the princeling has backed himself into a corner, and there's no way to get him out. But she had to try, even if it meant taking her life in her hands. Your Majesty, Lila said, hoping to change the subject. I'm sorry to interrupt, but before Lieutenant Karn and I go, I wondered if you might want to choose a new talisman from this old flash collection. Irritation flickered across the king's face. Why would I want to do that? Well, since people say that old flash is the best, so— I'm happy with what I have, Montaigne said, waving her away and turning back to Ash. Well, healer, the General makes a good point. He does, Your Majesty, Ash said. I am happy to oblige. He picked up the bottle, uncorked it, tipped back his head, and sipped. His lips were silvered when he lowered the bottle. They all stared as he pulled his handkerchief from his pocket and blotted it away. I don't recommend drinking it, as it's not the best use of a precious element, but as you can see, it is perfectly safe. The king smiled. I am convinced, healer, and therefore I will keep the Empress's gift for myself. As you wish, Ash bowed. Careful, he warned. It's heavier than you think. He put the bottle into the King of Arden's hands. 32. A Little Bad Judgment. Jenna dreamed she was back at the Lady of Grace, in her Lyle truth-teller guise, with the scent of coal fires and mutton stew in her nose, and the laments of a mediocre minstrel in her ears. Behind the bar, her father stood, alive again. She felt the pressure of his anxious eyes, always waiting for her to disappear. Across the table, in her client chair, sat Adam Wolfe, his hair an honest red. Jenna shuffled and reshuffled the cards, once losing hold of them so that they scattered across the battered wood like rose petals. She and the healer both reached for the cards, and their hands collided. They yanked their hands back like they'd been burned. Jenna scooped up the cards, stacked them, and slapped them down on the table in rows. One by one, she turned them over, arranging them like puzzle pieces.
"You will meet a girl," she said, "who will bring heartbreak and trouble into your life. 1,000 times you will curse the day you met her."
"No." The healer raked the cards from the table and onto the floor.
"I won't accept that."
He reached across the table and took her hands.
"We have a future. I know we do. Now tell me a different truth."
The scene dissolved, and she was looking into a pair of golden eyes just like her own. Fierce, hypnotic eyes in a jeweled setting. But the light in them was going out. There was a pain in her shoulders, as if she carried a weight too heavy to lift. The stench of rotten meat filled her nostrils and burned her eyes. The floor rocked gently under her.
"Flamecaster, we are trapped in a dark place, and we cannot see the sky."
The back of her neck prickled and burned. She extended her arms and saw glittering scales where her skin had been, her nails growing into claws. She breathed in the scent of prey, then realized that something furry was crawling across her knee. Swearing, she sent the creature flying into the darkness, burning like a shooting star. It squealed once as it hit the wall, then went silent. She hunted for it, her wings hitting the walls on all sides, following her nose to fresh meat. She was starving, and yet she could not find food. She screamed in frustration. Light blinded her. It must be the skins who had imprisoned her. She gathered herself, found her flame, roared a challenge. She might be weak, but she could still make a kill. Then she caught a familiar scent and knew. It was the wolf. She heard shouts outside the door, banging, someone fumbling with the latch. The scent of burning fur and flesh slowly faded, along with the remnants of the dream, as she remembered where she was. She was no longer in the dungeon. She was in new quarters, high in the King of Arden's tower, with a window overlooking the river. The door burst open, and the wolf was across the room in a few long strides, kneeling next to her so that he could look into her face and take her hand in his.
"Jenna, what is it? What's wrong?"
His voice and his scent, more than anything, anchored her back in her body.
"It was nothing. A dream."
She took a deep breath, then let it out. The wind from the river stirred her hair, bringing with it a memory of fish and salt water, and the not-too-distant sea. She'd fallen asleep reading in the chair by the window, the one place where she could see the sky. Adam drove off the blackbirds who had swarmed through the door on his heels, saying, "It was just a dream." When they'd left, he turned back to her.
"You're shaking."
He pressed the back of his hand against her forehead.
"No fever."
He stood and ignited a lamp on the table with the tips of his fingers. While his back was turned, Jenna examined her hands and arms in the moonlight. They looked perfectly normal. No claws, no scales. She breathed a sigh of relief, then thought, "Are you losing your mind?"
"I dreamed I was back in the dungeon, and there was a rat, and I was going to eat it," she blurted.
He turned, hands on hips, and raised an eyebrow.
"I know you're always hungry, but that's setting the bar pretty low. I'd have brought you some more food, but they told me you just had supper."
She shook her head, her cheeks heating with embarrassment. No, it's not that. You know how you just have stupid dreams sometimes?"
"You're right," he said, his face clouding. "Sometimes we do have stupid dreams."
He pulled a chair in close and sat, so they were almost knee to knee.
"I'm glad to see that Lieutenant Khan came through. I didn't realize that you had moved upstairs until I went to the dungeon and you weren't there."
He looked around. "This is much better." And it was. The room was small, being high in the tower with curved walls. The furnishings were plain, a bed with a thick straw mattress and plenty of quilts and coverlets, a stand with a pitcher and wash basin, 2 chairs, a screen in the corner to hide the chamber pot, a hearth with a crackling fire, and a window. A barred window, of course, but a window nonetheless.
"It will do, I suppose,"
she said, mimicking some of the finer guests at the lady.
"The servants are surly and the food marginal, but there is a view of the harbour."
He laughed. I'm guessing this is where King Gerard keeps some of his more valuable political prisoners. To be fair, it was larger and finer than the rooms at the Lady of Grace. Still, it seemed crowded with Adam in the room, especially now that she no longer wore the armor of filth and illness. At every moment she was acutely aware of his position and the distance between them. He was looking at her expectantly, and she realized that he was waiting for her to say something.
As you can probably tell, Khan made good on his promise of a bath and a change of clothes."
You do look different, he said, studying her through narrowed eyes. I'm not used to seeing you in a dress. She tugged at her bodice self-consciously.
"This one's a little tight across the... It's a little tight. But the seamstress said she'd bring something made to measure tomorrow."
Sucking in a quick breath, she stumbled on.
"I'm not used to dresses. I've been playing a boy for 4 years, nearly all the time, so it feels odd not to be wearing breeches."
I had no idea your hair was so many colors, Adam said. Copper and gold and silver and amethyst. It's almost metallic. I've never seen anything like it. He reached out and fingered it, and gooseflesh rose on her back and shoulders.
"Now you know how dirty it was. My da always said that when I was a baby it looked like I stood on my head on a painter's palette and spun around."
Gah, shut your mouth. She'd never learned to flirt. She'd had no practice at it. Besides, flirting seemed too lightweight a term to fit what was happening between them. A prickling heat crept up from her shoulders and into her face. The memory of their kiss hung between them like forbidden fruit. Everything they said or did seemed charged with meaning. Desire crouched in the room with them like an awkward guest. Now what? Where do we go from here? Do we back away or go forward? Maybe Adam felt the same pressure, because he seemed to be groping for something else to talk about. What are you reading? He reached for the book on her lap, picked it up, and leafed through it. Alenson's History of the Realms? We read that at school. Highly subversive. He cocked his head. Khan brought this? He's stalling, she thought. There's something he doesn't want to tell me. When he handed the book back, she set it aside. After another siege of silence, Jenna reached out and took both his hands, looking for a clue. The only image that came to her was that of a ship, hazy-looking, shrouded in mist, more like somebody's idea of a ship. "I dreamed I read the cards for you," she said. And I predicted I would bring heartbreak and trouble into your life," she said. Too late, he said, staring down at their joined hands. Heartbreak and trouble got there ahead of you. "You may as well tell me what's on your mind," she said, releasing his hands. "What's the news? Am I to be executed? Sold into slavery?" The look on the healer's face said she wasn't far off the mark. "An emissary has come from the Empress Celestine," he said. "She's the one Lieutenant Khan was asking you about. Apparently, she's offering to trade a sack of diamonds, a mysterious weapon, and an army for you." He paused, looking around the room again. "That might explain the sudden hospitality. Montaigne doesn't want to be accused of trading in damaged goods." "Then he's damned lucky you're so good at what you do." Unable to sit still, Jenna stood, crossed to the hearth, and poked at the fire with a stick. "Why would somebody I don't even know be offering that kind of swag for me?" "There's to be a meeting in 2 days," Adam said to her back. "Maybe we'll find out then. I wanted to warn you ahead of time.
Good, Jenna said, staring into the flames. We'll get it sorted out before this goes much further.
When he didn't reply, she turned back to face him. Adam was chewing his lower lip, his face all over dread, as if trying to decide whether to keep delivering bad news or leave her in the dark.
You're wondering if I'm stupid or naive or both, Jenna said. I'm neither.
Settling down on the thick rug in front of the hearth, she patted the space beside her.
Sit with me, Wolf.
Just for a heartbeat, she thought he wouldn't come. But then he did, crossing the room and dropping to the floor beside her. He sat, his thigh pressing against hers, one knee up, the other leg extended straight out in front of him. She arched her back, wriggling a little, enjoying the heat and the crackle of flames, while she tried to work out what to say.
This is an argument I used to have with my da all the time. He was the kind who saw disaster waiting around every corner.
See, he was right, Adam said, fussing with his collar, as if it pinched.
He was right, after 16 years, she said. We spend so much of our lives waiting to be ambushed by heartbreak. Why couldn't we be ambushed by joy? Anything's possible, right?
Anything's possible, Adam said, staring up at the ceiling, a muscle working in his jaw.
Take a wolf, for example, she persisted. If he's got a thorn in his foot, he's miserable and snappish, like a person would be. Once you take it out, does he worry it's going to get infected, or he's going to step on another thorn?
No. Adam shifted his body, the friction between them sending her heart into a gallop.
Does he cut off his paw to make sure it doesn't happen again?
Adam snorted, his lips twitching. No.
Does he beat up on himself because he was careless, or he took the shortcut through the bramble?
She shook her head.
No. He moves on. He enjoys the fact that he's not in pain. He doesn't know what's coming, whether he'll bring down a fell's deer or break his leg and freeze to death. But he recognizes that he doesn't know. But people, we act like we do. We write that bad ending before we even get there.
Isn't that what makes us human? The ability to look at the present and predict what's likely to happen.
But we're really not all that good at it, are we?
No, he said. Jenna rested her hand on his thigh and heard his startled intake of breath. They both looked at it, a pale starfish against his dark breeches.
Take me, for instance.
Startled, he looked up. Excuse me, he said hoarsely.
By most standards, I've had a miserable life. Orphan, raised in Delphi, forced into the mines at a young age, marked for death since birth.
He eyed her, his brow furrowed, as if waiting for the punchline. So, how does that...
And yet, dozens of times, I've been ambushed by joy and beauty in the most unlikely places, things I would have missed if I'd been preoccupied by pain. A sunrise over a slag heap, ham for breakfast when I didn't expect it, a song that goes straight to the heart.
She ran her fingers along his thigh, feeling his muscles tighten under her hand.
Maybe it's primitive to live in the moment, but there are advantages. For instance, I never expected to be ambushed by love in a dungeon.
Jenna turned toward him, coming up onto her knees so they were at eye level. She looked into his face, reading the heat and hunger in his eyes. Me neither, he whispered, sliding his arms around her, pulling her in close. He kissed her. It was even more intoxicating the second time, and the third. Then she lost count as his fingers tangled in her hair and he pressed his body against hers. It was all lean, hard muscle, and it fit in against hers just right. Then he kissed her throat and her mouth again, long and sweet, It hit her like a gulp of stingo, running down into her middle and kindling a flame there. She caught his lip between her teeth, nibbling it gently, then tipped him backward so that they were lying flat on the rug. She wrapped her arms around his neck and devoured him with kisses, his lips, his neck above the silver collar, that place just behind his ear. She slid her hands under his tunic, walking her fingers down his spine to the hollow at the base. He kissed her lips, her throat, the tops of her breasts, then crushed her to him, cradling her backside with his large hands. His fingers set off little explosions where they touched her skin that had nothing to do with Marjorie. She sat up then, one knee to either side of him, and fumbled with the laces on her bodice. She had no skill at it, though, and before she got far, he caught her wrists, pulling her hands away.
"Jenna,"
he said, looking dazed, like he'd stood too close when a deep mind charge went off. Despite the desire in his voice, there was a no there, too. "Let go, Wolf." She shifted, pulled, trying to free herself. She could feel his body respond, and that made matters worse.
"You don't understand," he said. "I've been here too long already. The blackbirds, they could come in at any moment."
"Damn the blackbirds!" She was strong, but he was stronger. It was like a cruel joke. The more she struggled, the hotter she burned, and the harder it was to let him go. Finally, he rolled her over so she was on her back and he on top, sitting astride her. He pinned her hands to the floor and looked down at her, breathing hard like he'd been running a race.
"You are making it really difficult to do the right thing," Adam gasped. "You know that, don't you?"
"This is the right thing," Jenna said, arching her back so she pressed up against him. With that, he straightened his arms, and his weight came off her as he levered himself to his feet, putting the chair between them. Jenna hung her head, cheeks burning. "I'm sorry," she said. I only—"
"Don't be sorry,"
Adam said, his hands clenching the back of the chair, his eyes glittering in the firelight.
"This is the right thing. It's just not the right time. I don't want it to be like this."
He gestured, taking in the tower room.
"Hasty and furtive, under constant risk of interruption."
She knew he was right, but still, she couldn't help saying, "If not now, when? What if this is it and we never—" Her voice broke. She tried again. "What if we look back and say, if only—" He crossed the room to her and gripped her shoulders, his eyes darkening to the color of the deepest lakes.
"I promise you, Jenna,"
he said, his face fierce with purpose.
"This is not it. I will find a way to—"
She pressed her hands against his lips. "No promises, Hila." She pulled his head down and stopped the promises with kisses. 33. Playing the king's game. Was the king burning his gift of living silver or not? That was the question. For all Ash knew, the vial he'd given the king was rolling around in a drawer somewhere. He'd shot his poison arrow into the air, but he didn't know if it would hit a vital spot, and whether it would be soon enough to allow him to keep the promise he had tried to make to Jenna. He'd reviewed the telltale symptoms in Talison's leather-bound book. Tremors, mental and emotional impairment, skin changes. Montaigne didn't need to die from it, only feel poorly enough to call on Ash for treatment so he could finish the job. Though he watched the king carefully, he saw nothing promising. Montaigne remained astonishingly, annoyingly healthy. Meanwhile, Ash kept adding to his arsenal of easily hidden, easily deployed, easily explained assassin's tools. Fortunately, many of the medical tools in his healer's kit were dual-purpose. Shivs, scissors, scalpels, these were all edged weapons that could be used on either side of the line. A garrote was threaded through the hem of his tunic. He still had the sting under his collar, ready to deploy if the opportunity presented itself. All he needed was the smallest of openings to make sure of him, but the multiple attempts on the king's life had put him on his guard, and it was challenging to get anywhere close to him. Ash wished the competition would either succeed or get out of the way. At least there hadn't been any more tries since the wassail incident, that he knew about anyway. Give it another year or two, and the king might grow careless again. That was a problem. He didn't have a year or two. He had a day. Now it was the feast of St. Malthus, on the 4th day after solstice, and the king's meeting with the Empress's emissary was scheduled for tomorrow. He toyed with the idea of killing the emissary instead, but the Carthians stayed on their ship, out of reach. Instead, Ash found himself in the Queen's bedchamber, trying to prevent the King of Arden from undoing his hard work. He'd been called in because Queen Marina had wilted while her attendants were trying to dress her for the annual Saints' Day dinner. She lay back in bed, dark hair spread across the pillows, her usually dusky skin nearly as pale as the sheets, save for the places where blue veins showed through. She's skin and bones, Ash thought. She has no reserves. Montaigne paced back and forth, ablaze with all the badges of his office, his boots clicking on the stone floor. He was in a dangerous mood, even for him.
Can't you give her something, healer, to get her through this? Every Thane in the kingdom is here. Rumors are flying that the queen is dead. They need to see her alive and well. He paused. Especially now. The low flame that had burned inside Ash ever since his father's death blazed up. This is the man who declared war on the Fells when my mother refused to marry him, Ash thought. They'd been at war ever since. She'd paid a high price. They all had. But it could be Raisa lying here, being dithered over like a side of beef with no agency of her own. No, he thought. She wouldn't have lasted this long. One or the other of them would be dead. Ash was beginning to recognize just what his mother the Queen had accomplished in keeping this southern tyrant out of the Fells. There's just one problem, Your Majesty, he said through his teeth. The Queen is alive, thank the Maker, but she is not well. What she needs is rest and quiet and good, nourishing food, not a public ordeal. We cannot have people think it is a simple matter to murder a sovereign. That would send the wrong message. What kind of message would it send, Your Majesty, were the Queen to collapse during dinner? Ash said in a barely civil tone. If tongues are wagging now, that would only make matters worse. It's your job to make sure that doesn't happen, Montaigne said.
Never mind, healer, the Queen said. The king is right, of course. I need to be there.
She propped up on her elbows and nodded to her ladies, who carried several dresses to the bedside for Marina to choose from. Ordinarily, when the Queen was indisposed, as she often was, Lady Estelle would step in as hostess. The King of Arden saw no reason to keep his mistresses hidden away. But Estelle was dead, killed for the crime of hosting an assassination attempt on the king. Wittingly or unwittingly. Hence the current crisis. The king needed to make show.
I want my queen by my side at dinner, the king said. Why is that so difficult to understand?
He ripped a dress from the hands of one of the Queen's ladies and thrust it into Marina's face.
Put this on, and drink a measure of rum if that's what it takes to put a little color in your cheeks. Our guests are already seated, and I don't like to give them time to conspire together in my absence.
The Queen sat frozen in her bed, holding the dress up like a shield.
I told you to get dressed, you stupid slut of Tamron. Are you deaf?
Your Majesty, please, Lady Argencourt, one of the Queen's ladies, murmured, gesturing at the crowd of blackbirds in the room. If you could give the Queen a little privacy.
I want to see you downstairs in less than 15 minutes, Montaigne said. Freeman, you will attend the Queen in the dining room to handle anything that might arise, and find something other than that bloody healer Brown to wear. Having a healer hover over her would also send the wrong message.
Of course, Your Majesty, Ash said. Signaling to his blackbird guard, the king strode from the room, leaving Ash with two questions. Would he at long last get close enough to the king to do some actual damage? And where could he possibly get hold of dinner clothes in the next 15 minutes? When he was sure the king was gone, Ash turned back to the queen. "No rum, Your Grace," he said, "not while your liver is still recovering from the poison. I suggest small beer or tea."
"Tea suits me well, Master Freeman," the queen said.
"Good," Ash said. "And finally, would any of you know where I could find some suitable clothes in a hurry?" 15 minutes later, Ash was shadowing the queen into the state dining room. Somehow, Queen Marina's ladies had managed to scrounge up some black breeches and a doublet in green velvet and leather that fit, more or less. Happily, he had a fine silver collar to go with. It had been a long time since he'd worn anything resembling court garb. It felt like he was wearing a costume. As soon as they crossed the threshold, Ash could tell that something was wrong. The tension in the room was as thick as day-old porridge, and the room was lined with more blackbirds than was usual, even these days. The main course had been served, but most of the plates looked to be untouched. The women in the room were staring down at the table, as if they hoped they could disappear. All eyes were fixed on a tall, muscular Thane with a bristle of gray hair and a black eye patch. He stood at the end of the table nearest the door, surrounded by a handful of men-at-arms. He was the kind of hard-bitten soldier who looked out of place in civilian clothes. Next to him stood a much younger edition of the Thane, maybe 12 or 13, this one in mudback brown. As they walked in, the queen seemed to tap some hidden reservoir of strength. Her spine straightened, her chin rose, and she smiled brilliantly when the guests rose to greet her. She walked the length of the room with great dignity and took her place beside the king. Ash followed a few steps behind and stood against the wall behind the royal couple, staring at the barricade of blackbirds between him and the king. No opportunity there, Ash thought. Montaigne kissed Queen Marina's hand, turned to the other guests, and said through gritted teeth, "I know you'll join with me in toasting Her Majesty's good health." This was met with a murmur of good wishes and a few raised glasses, but it didn't change the mood in the room. It looked more like a standoff than a dinner party. Marin Karn, for instance, looked like he could chew rocks and spit out gravel. "Sit down, Lord Matalon, and eat," the king said. "This is the Saints' Day. It is not the appropriate time to discuss the state of the war."